Close your eyes for a moment. It is the year 476. In the canal city of Ravenna, a teenage boy is taking off a crown. His name is Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. He is perhaps 15 years old. He did not choose this role, and the man ending it does not arrive as a conqueror. He arrives with paperwork. A soldier named Odoacer informs the boy that the Western Empire no longer needs its own emperor, arranges a pension, and sends a polite letter to Constantinople explaining the change. That is how the Western Roman Empire ends. Not with fire, not with a final battle, with an administrative decision. For centuries, people told this story as the collapse of civilization, barbarian horde, savage invaders, the lights going out across Europe. But the reality was stranger, quieter, and far more complicated. Many of the people Rome called barbarians had lived inside the empire for generations. They served in Roman armies, worshipped in Roman churches, spoke Latin alongside their own languages, and admired Rome deeply enough to want a place inside its world rather than outside it. They did not simply destroy Rome. In many ways, they inherited it. Tonight we follow the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons as they stepped into the ruins of the Western Empire and built the foundations of medieval Europe from its broken pieces. Some tried to preserve Rome, some tried to replace it. All of them became part of what came next. Settle in. Let the room grow quiet. The ruins are still warm, and the people history called barbarians are about to build the future. Chapter 1. Who were the barbarians? Really? Start with the word itself. Barbarian. It comes from the Greek barbaros, which the ancient Greeks used to describe anyone who did not speak Greek. To Greek ears, foreign speech resembled someone repeating the syllables bar, bar, sounds without meaning. The Romans borrowed the term and applied it broadly to the peoples living beyond their northern and eastern frontiers. It was not, at its origin, a description of behavior. It was not a judgment of intelligence or moral worth or capacity for civilization. It was simply a word that meant, not us. That distinction matters enormously for everything that follows, because the people history has labeled barbarians were not a single people, not a unified force, and not, for the most part, the wild and savage destroyers that centuries of storytelling made them into. They were dozens of distinct groups with different languages, different customs, different political structures, and different relationships with Rome, ranging from centuries of settled coexistence to genuine military hostility. Treating them as a single category is a little like describing everyone who ever crossed the Atlantic as sailors and assuming they all wanted the same thing. So who were they, really? The groups that matter most for this story fall into several broad families. The Goths, divided by the time they enter the historical record, clearly into two main branches, the Visigoths in the west and the Ostrogoths in the east, spoke related Germanic languages and had histories of both conflict and cooperation with Rome stretching back more than a century before the Western Empire fell. The Franks occupied the territory Rome called Gaul, roughly modern France and Belgium, and had been providing soldiers to Roman legions for generations. The Vandals had travelled an extraordinary distance, from origins in what is now Poland and eastern Germany, through Gaul, into Spain, and eventually across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa, where they built a kingdom that controlled the most important sea lanes in the Western Mediterranean. The Lombards were later arrivals who would reshape Italy in ways still visible in the name of one of its most prosperous regions today. The Angles and Saxons crossed the North Sea into Britain after Rome withdrew from the island. and the language they brought with them became the foundation of the one being spoken right now. Each of these groups deserves its own story, and each will get one. But before those stories can be told properly, something needs to be said about the relationship between all of them and Rome, because it was far more intimate and far more complicated than the word barbarian was designed to suggest. By the 4th century, the Roman military was not primarily Roman in any ethnic sense. It was sustained by soldiers recruited from the very peoples it was nominally defending against. Germanic warriors served in Roman legions, commanded Roman units, rose to positions of genuine authority within the Roman command structure. Men with Gothic and Frankish and other Germanic names appear in the historical record as senior officers, military commanders, even generals leading Roman armies against other Germanic groups on behalf of the empire. The line between Roman soldier and Germanic warrior had been blurring for more than a century before the Western Empire fell. This was not a secret or a scandal. It was deliberate policy. Rome needed soldiers more than it needed those soldiers to be ethnically Italian. The empire was vast. Its borders were long, and the populations of the Italian heartland were neither large enough nor, by the later imperial period, sufficiently motivated to fill the ranks that maintaining those borders required. Recruiting from outside was not a symptom of decline. It was a rational response to a genuine logistical problem. But it had consequences that no Roman policymaker fully anticipated. When Germanic soldiers served in Roman armies for years or decades, they did not remain unchanged by the experience. They learned Latin, or at least enough of it to function in a multilingual military environment. They absorbed Roman administrative practices, Roman ideas about law and governance, Roman religious traditions. Especially after the empire became officially Christian in the 4th century under the Emperor Constantine, they returned home. When they returned at all, carrying pieces of Rome with them, their children grew up in communities that had been shaped, sometimes profoundly, by generations of contact with the empire across the frontier. There is a man whose life captures this process better than almost any other figure of the period. His name was Wulfila, sometimes written Ulfilas in the Latin sources, and he was born around the year 310 in the frontier zone between the Roman world and the Gothic world, to a family of mixed background whose very existence embodied the complexity of that border. He became a Christian bishop, was sent as a missionary to the Gothic peoples, and spent decades among them doing something that no one had done before. He invented a written alphabet for the Gothic language and used it to translate the Bible. Think about what that meant in practice. To translate a text, you must understand both languages deeply enough to carry meaning across them. To translate the Bible, you must also understand the theology well enough to choose which words carry which concepts. Wulfila was doing all of this in the 4th century, in a frontier zone between two worlds, producing a text that gave the Gothic people access to the most important book in the Christian tradition in their own language. The Gothic Bible is one of the most important surviving documents in the history of Germanic languages. Fragments of it survive, copied centuries after the original, and they allow modern linguists to study Gothic, the oldest, well-documented Germanic language, in ways that would otherwise be impossible. It was produced not in some distant wilderness untouched by Rome, but in the living zone of contact between two civilizations, by a man who moved between them with equal fluency. By the time the Visigoths crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376, fleeing pressure from the Huns pressing from the east, they were already Christian, not pagans encountering a new faith in Roman territory, but a people who had received Christianity a generation earlier through exactly this kind of frontier transmission. The faith they practiced was the Arian form, which differed from the Nicene Christianity that the Roman imperial church had formally adopted. and that theological difference would cause significant political complications later. But the point is that when the Visigoths entered Roman territory, they entered it as Christians, carrying a Bible in their own language. The line between insider and outsider was already much less clear than the word barbarian implied. This pattern repeated itself, in various forms, across most of the peoples in this story. Long contact with Rome, through trade, through military service, through captivity, through missionary activity, had produced populations that were not Roman, but were not entirely separate from Rome either. They existed in a complex middle space that the Roman categories of citizen and barbarian were never designed to describe accurately. These were people shaped by Rome deeply enough to recognize what they were entering when they crossed the frontiers, and to want, in ways that would define the next 3 centuries of European history, to make something of it. One more thing needs to be said before the individual stories begin. Almost everything that happened in the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century was shaped, directly or indirectly, by a force arriving from the East. A force that operated by entirely different principles, that set in motion a chain of displacements so large and so fast that the Roman system, already under strain, could not absorb them. In the chapters that follow, you will meet that force. You will understand why its appearance, at the specific moment it arrived, made everything else in this story move differently than it might otherwise have moved. But first, the Visigoths, and the river they crossed in 376, fleeing something they could not outrun. Chapter 2. The Visigoths' First Inheritors. There is a specific kind of frustration that comes from being told, repeatedly, that you are almost one of us, that you have almost earned your place, that the recognition you have worked toward is almost within reach, and then watching it recede again every time you approach it. That frustration, accumulated over decades and generations, is the key that unlocks the Visigoth story. The Visigoths had been present in and around Roman territory long enough that by the late 4th century their identity was deeply intertwined with Rome in ways neither side fully acknowledged. They had served in Roman armies. Their nobility had learned Roman customs. Their people had received Christian faith through Wulfula's mission. They had absorbed enough of the Roman world to want to be part of it formally, to want the recognition that would transform their presence from tolerated utility into genuine belonging. Rome kept almost giving it to them. In 376, a massive Gothic population arrived at the Danube River and asked the Eastern Emperor Valens for permission to cross. They were not coming to conquer. They were fleeing. Behind them, moving with a speed and a violence that seemed to contemporaries almost supernatural, were the Huns, whose sudden expansion westward from the Eurasian steppe had shattered the political structures that had organized Gothic life for generations. The Goths at the Danube that year were refugees in the most fundamental sense, a people who had nowhere to go except to cross the river. Valens agreed to let them cross. The decision made strategic sense on paper. Here was a large population already familiar with Roman military service, already Christian, already integrated into the economic networks of the Roman frontier, settled on Roman land. They could provide soldiers and tax revenue. They could be an asset. What followed was one of the clearest examples in ancient history of how reasonable policy can become catastrophe through bad execution. The Roman officials responsible for receiving the Gothic refugees were, by the consistent testimony of multiple ancient sources, corrupt in ways that went beyond ordinary venality. Rations promised to the newcomers did not arrive, or arrived spoiled and insufficient. Officials organized schemes to exploit the desperate people in their charge, trading food for Gothic children to be used as slaves, demanding bribes for basic necessities that the settlement agreement had guaranteed. A man named Lupicinus, one of the Roman commanders responsible for managing the resettlement, appears in the sources as particularly systematic in his exploitation of the situation. The Goths, who had crossed the Danube in good faith, found themselves hungry, humiliated, and increasingly furious in a land that had promised them refuge and delivered exploitation. The revolt that followed was almost inevitable. At Adrianople, in 378, in what is now northwestern Turkey, the army of Emperor Valens met the Gothic force in open battle. The Roman army was destroyed with a completeness that shocked the ancient world. Valens himself was killed, making him one of the very few Roman emperors to die in battle against a foreign enemy. The scale of the defeat was not merely military, it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the empire could no longer reliably control the people it had invited inside its borders. The settlement that followed, negotiated by Valens's successor, Theodosius I, was itself historically significant. The Goths were allowed to remain within Roman territory under their own leaders, maintaining their own military organization, operating as an allied force rather than as absorbed subjects. It was a recognition that full integration was no longer possible on Roman terms, and a template that would be used again and again over the next century. Now come to the man who inherited this situation and spent the rest of his life trying to force Rome to acknowledge what his people had earned. His name was Alaric. He had served in the Roman military. He had led Gothic troops fighting for Rome and had proven himself capable in ways that he believed, reasonably, warranted official recognition that would give his leadership formal standing within the imperial system. He wanted a senior command, a title, the acknowledgement that he and his people were genuine partners in defending the empire rather than auxiliaries to be used and discarded. He was repeatedly denied. The reasons involved complex court politics, competing factions, genuine Roman anxiety about delegating too much authority to a Gothic leader commanding Gothic troops. The reasons were not, from the Roman perspective, personnel. From Alaric's experience, they accumulated year by year into something that felt like a systematic refusal to acknowledge what his people had earned through their service and their sacrifice. What followed was more than a decade of movement through the Balkans and eventually into Italy. Each phase of it, a negotiation conducted by people who could not be ignored. Each phase of it ending in the same place. A Roman government too fractured to conclude a settlement. An Alaric too committed to his people's recognition to accept less than what he believed they deserved. In 410, after 2 failed sieges and a final breakdown in negotiations with the Western court, Alaric's forces entered Rome. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. Rome had not been sacked by a foreign force in 800 years. When the news reached St. Augustine in North Africa, he began writing a response to the theological crisis it provoked, a work he would spend 13 years completing, a book called The City of God, which became one of the most influential texts in the history of Western Christianity. The fall of Rome to Alaric did not just change a city, it shook a civilization's sense of itself. And yet the physical reality of those 3 days was considerably less apocalyptic than the psychological impact suggested. Alaric gave explicit orders. The great churches of Rome, the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, were to be treated as sanctuaries. Anyone who took refuge in them was not to be harmed. The looting was real. Gold and silver and centuries of accumulated portable wealth were taken. But the great public buildings were not burned. The population was not massacred. The city's infrastructure was not deliberately destroyed. Ancient source hostile to the Visigoths. Sources with every reason to report atrocities if they had occurred. Do not describe systematic destruction of the kind that later legend sometimes attached to the event. This restraint reflected something genuine about what the Visigoths understood themselves to be. They were Christians sacking a Christian city. They had absorbed enough Roman values to understand the historical weight of what they were doing. Alaric died within weeks of leaving Rome. In southern Italy, his plans for crossing into North Africa unrealized. He was buried, according to the most famous account, in the bed of a river temporarily diverted for the purpose. The water then redirected to cover his grave. Whether this story is literally accurate cannot be verified, but it has the feeling of truth about the end of a man who spent his life trying to find a permanent place in a world that never quite made room for him. The Visigoths who followed Alaric moved west and eventually settled in what is now southwestern France and most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse and later Toledo became one of the more sophisticated political entities of the post-Roman West. Their law codes drew heavily on Roman legal tradition, adapting Roman principles for the practical governance of a mixed population of Gothic newcomers and established Roman residents. The Breviary of Alaric II, produced in 506, was a systematic compilation of Roman law prepared specifically for the Roman population living under Visigothic rule. A Germanic king commissioning a Roman law code for his Roman subjects, 3 generations after his ancestor sacked Rome, is the kind of detail that the dramatic narrative of barbarian invasion consistently obscures. The Visigothic kingdom lasted nearly 300 years before it was ended, not from within, but from across the water. In 711, a force from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and within a few years had overrun most of the Iberian Peninsula. The last Visigothic king died in battle. The kingdom was gone, but what it had preserved did not disappear with it. The Roman legal traditions the Visigoths had codified fed into the legal cultures of medieval Spain. The church structures they had maintained became the organizational backbone of Christian Iberia through the centuries that followed. The idea that a Germanic people could govern a predominantly Roman population by adapting Roman institutions rather than replacing them, which the Visigoths had demonstrated across 3 centuries, became a model that other kingdoms would learn from and build upon. They had come as refugees, desperate and hungry, across a river in 376. They stayed as builders, and something of what they built outlasted the builders by centuries. Chapter 3. Attila and the pressure that broke everything. There is a historian named Priscus of Panium who travelled to the court of the most feared man in the world in 449 and wrote down what he saw. Priscus was a diplomat and scholar attached to a Roman embassy sent from Constantinople to negotiate with Attila, and the account he left, surviving in fragments quoted by later writers, is one of the most remarkable documents of the 5th century. It is a first-hand description of a man whose name had become synonymous with destruction and terror, written by someone who ate at his table and watched him move through his daily life. What Priscus describes is not the howling savage of legend. He describes a man who received foreign ambassadors in a large wooden hall, well-made and spacious, but timber rather than stone or marble. A man whose clothing was plain and clean, deliberately simple, who drank from a wooden cup while the men around him drank from vessels of gold and silver. A man who showed dry humour in conversation, who managed his court with evident political intelligence, and who seemed entirely aware of the effect his deliberate plainness had on visitors accustomed to the elaborate ceremonial of the Roman world. The simplicity was a statement. He did not need marble to demonstrate power. He had other ways of doing that. To understand why Attila matters so much to the story of the post-Roman kingdoms, you have to understand what he represented before he was a conqueror. The Huns who appear in the historical record in the late 4th century remain, in several important ways, genuinely mysterious to historians. Their origins, on the Eurasian steppe, are clear enough in broad outline. They were part of a long tradition of mounted pastoral peoples who had developed military capabilities, particularly the composite bow used from horseback at speed, that made them extraordinarily effective against armies built for different kinds of warfare. The precise path of their movement westward before they enter the Roman historical record, and questions about their earlier connections to other steppe peoples, remain subjects of genuine scholarly debate. What is not debated is what they did when they arrived in the world Rome occupied. The Hunnic expansion westward, beginning in the 370s, set in motion a chain of displacements that reshaped the entire political landscape of the Western Roman Empire. The Goths who fled across the Danube in 376 were fleeing Hunnic pressure. The Germanic groups who crossed the Rhine in force in the first years of the 5th century, flooding into Gaul and beginning the process that would eventually carry the Vandals to North Africa, were pushed, at least partly, by the destabilization that Hunnic expansion had caused in the political arrangements east of the Rhine. The map of post-Roman Europe would likely have looked significantly different if the Huns had not arrived when they did and with the force they brought. Attila himself comes to power around 434, initially sharing rule with his brother Bleda, and then, after Bleda's death in 444, ruling alone. The circumstances of Bleda's death are not entirely clear in the sources. Ancient accounts suggesting Attila had his brother killed cannot be independently verified, though the suspicion appears early and persists through the historical tradition. Under Attila's sole leadership, the Hunnic Empire reached its greatest extent and its most formidable military effectiveness. He campaigned against the Eastern Roman Empire repeatedly, extracting tribute payments that strained Constantinople's finances significantly. The Eastern Empire paid not because it had no choice in any absolute sense, but because the calculated cost of continued warfare was judged higher than the cost of the tribute. It was a cold assessment, and Attila understood it perfectly. He was extracting the maximum the traffic would bear, year after year, with the patience of someone who knew his leverage and intended to use it indefinitely. His attention eventually turned west, and the reasons involve one of the stranger episodes of the period. A Roman princess named Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had found herself in a situation she found intolerable. After a romantic scandal at court, her freedom had been significantly curtailed, and her future reduced to a politically arranged marriage she did not want. She sent a message to Attila that included her ring. Ancient sources interpreted this as a marriage proposal, or at minimum, as an appeal for intervention. What Honoria actually intended remains debated by historians. What matters is that Attila chose to interpret it as a claim, and used it as a pretext to demand half the Western Empire as a dowry. Valentinian refused. Attila invaded Gaul in 451 with a force whose size that ancient sources describe in numbers that historians treat with considerable caution, since ancient writers consistently exaggerated army sizes in ways that the logistics of the period make impossible to take literally. What is not exaggerated is the devastation the campaign left along its path through northeastern Gaul. Cities were sacked, populations displaced, and the record of those events left marks on the historical memory of the region for generations. He was met by a coalition assembled by the Roman general Aetius, a remarkable figure who had spent years as a hostage among the Huns in his youth, and who understood Hunnic warfare better than almost any other Roman commander of his generation. That coalition included the Visigoths under their king Theodoric I. The people who had crossed the Danube as desperate refugees in 376 were now fighting alongside Rome against a threat that both sides recognized as more dangerous than their complicated relationship with each other. The battle that followed near Chalons, in northeastern Gaul, known to historians as the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, was large enough that ancient sources describe it in terms of exceptional scale and ferocity. The tactical outcome was not a clean Roman victory. Attila withdrew afterward, which was unusual enough to be significant. But his forces were not destroyed. The Visigothic king Theodoric died in the fighting, which was a genuine loss for the coalition. The battle is often described in popular history as the moment that saved Western civilization. This framing should be approached with care. Attila invaded Italy the following year, reaching as far south as the Po Valley, sacking cities, including Aquileia, with devastating effect. He withdrew from Italy not because he was defeated, but apparently for reasons including disease in his forces, supply difficulties, and possibly the diplomatic intervention of Pope Leo I, whose meeting with Attila outside Mantua has generated one of the most enduring stories in early medieval tradition. What the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains represented, in the careful framing that the evidence supports, was one of the last significant engagements in which a Roman-led coalition operating within something resembling Roman strategic tradition checked a threat of this magnitude. Whether a different outcome would have permanently altered the trajectory of European history is a question historians continue to debate without reaching consensus. What stands clearly in the record is that it marks a symbolic boundary between the world that Rome had built and the world that was assembling itself from Rome's pieces. Attila died in 453 on the night of his wedding to a young woman named Ildico, ancien source, including Jordanes, writing a century later, describe him dying in his sleep from a nosebleed, suffocating on blood while unconscious after a night of celebration. Whether this was natural causes, the result of years of hard living, or something else, cannot be determined from the available evidence. It is consistent with known medical causes of sudden death, and most historians treat it as plausible while acknowledging the uncertainty. Without Attila, the Hunnic Empire collapsed with a speed that demonstrated how completely it had been built around one man's authority rather than around durable institutions. His sons fought over succession. The subject peoples who had been held together by fear and military success took the opportunity to assert their independence. Within a generation, the Huns had ceased to be a significant political force in European history. But the world they had set in motion did not stop moving when they stopped. The Ostrogoths, freed from Hunnic dominance for the first time in a generation, now had to decide what to do with their freedom. The answer they found would take them into Italy, into a brief and brilliant experiment in governance, and ultimately into one of the most painful endings of the entire post-Roman period. The story of the man who led them there begins with a boy in a palace in Constantinople, being taught the language of a civilization that would never fully claim him as its own. Chapter 4. Odoacer, the man who ended Rome without meaning to. There is a particular kind of historical moment that only becomes significant in retrospect. The people living through it do not experience it as a turning point. They experience it as a Tuesday. The administrative decision gets made. The document gets filed. The announcement goes out. And life continues more or less as it did the day before. It is only later, sometimes much later, that someone looks back and realizes that everything on one side of that Tuesday was fundamentally different from everything on the other side. The evening of September 4th, 476, was that kind of Tuesday. Romulus Augustulus had been emperor for less than a year. He had not chosen the role. His father, a military commander named Orestes, he had placed him on the throne in 475 after deposing the previous emperor, using his son as a convenient figurehead while holding the real power himself. The boy was young enough and historically obscure enough that later sources would mock him with a diminutive, calling him Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, a nickname that stuck in the historical record with the particular cruelty that history reserves for people who never had enough power to defend their own reputations. The man who came to remove him was not a conqueror in any traditional sense. Odoacer had risen through the ranks of the Roman military, as so many Germanic men had done before him. His specific ethnic origin is a question that ancient sources answer inconsistently. Different texts describe him as Syrian, Herulian, Rugian, or simply as a man of mixed origin from the frontier world. His father Edico had served in Attila's court, which gives some sense of how thoroughly the worlds of the late Roman frontier had intertwined by this period. By the time Odoacer became a figure of military importance in Italy, the categories that had seemed clear on paper had blurred almost beyond recognition in the lives of real people. What brought Odoacer to the point of deposing Romulus Augustulus was not ambition for imperial power. It was a practical dispute about land. The Germanic soldiers serving in the Roman army in Italy had been requesting, for some time, the same arrangement that Gothic and other allied soldiers had received elsewhere in the empire. They wanted 1/3 of the agricultural land of Italy allocated to them as settlement, the foederati arrangement that had been used with reasonable success in Gaul and Spain. Orestes refused. It was a politically understandable position and a practically catastrophic one. He was asking soldiers who had other options to continue serving under terms they had clearly decided were unacceptable. The revolt that followed was swift. Orestes was captured and killed. Romulus Augustulus was brought before Odoacer and, in a gesture that reveals something important about the nature of the moment, spared. The boy was too young, too obviously a puppet, and perhaps too plainly pitiable to make killing him serve any purpose. Odoacer arranged a pension for him, comfortable exile at a castle in Campania in southern Italy, and let him go. Then Odoacer did something that distinguished his action from every previous military coup in Roman history. He did not take the title of emperor. He sent a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, explaining that the Western Empire no longer required a separate emperor. That one emperor was sufficient for the whole Roman world, and that he, Odoacer, would govern Italy as the Eastern Court's representative with the more modest title of king. He sent the physical symbols of Western imperial office: the purple robes, the diadem, the ceremonial regalia that marked the position, to Constantinople. Along with his letter, Zeno's response was diplomatically ambiguous, acknowledging Odoacer's position in terms that were neither fully endorsing nor clearly refusing. The regalia went east and did not come back. What Odoacer had done, whether he understood its full historical weight or not, was dissolve the fiction that had been sustaining the Western Empire through its final decades. The Western emperors of the mid-5th century had been, almost without exception, powerless figures, elevated and discarded by military commanders who held actual authority. The empire they nominally ruled had lost Britain, most of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. What remained was a diminished peninsula administered by a government that could not reliably pay its own soldiers. Ending the office formally was, in this light, not a revolutionary act. It was an acknowledgement of a reality that had existed for a generation. The remarkable thing is not that someone finally did it. It is that it happened so quietly, on what felt, to the people living through it, like an ordinary evening. Odoacer governed Italy for the next 13 years with a pragmatism that the sources, read carefully, suggest was more effective than dramatic histories of the period typically allow. He maintained the Roman Senate. He kept Roman administrators in their positions. He continued using Latin as the language of government. He presented himself as a legitimate authority, operating within the framework of Roman tradition rather than displacing it. The legal system continued to function according to Roman law. The church was left to operate without interference. There was a young Roman aristocrat named Cassiodorus, then a boy in Calabria, who would grow up to serve the next regime and to write a history of the Goths that became one of our primary sources for the period. He remembered Odoacer's Italy in terms suggesting that for people of his class, daily life was recognizably continuous with what had come before. That is not a ringing endorsement of a regime. It is something more practically significant. It is evidence that the system was functioning. Odoacer's relationship with Constantinople remained tense. Zeno never fully accepted him as legitimate. And when an opportunity arose to solve the Italian problem without direct imperial military action, he took it. He pointed the Ostrogoths at Italy, setting in motion the arrival of the man who would become both the greatest hope and the greatest failure of the post-Roman West. But before we follow that story, Odoacer deserves the acknowledgement that history has largely withheld from him. He looked at the Western Roman Empire in its final, diminished, painful state and made the honest administrative decision that ending it formally was better than continuing a fiction that served no one. He did not declare himself emperor. He did not loot the institutions he inherited. He governed, as well as the circumstances allowed, and he kept Italy functional enough that when the next ruler arrived, there was something worth inheriting. The man who ended the Western Roman Empire was not a destroyer. He was, in his quiet and unheralded way, a caretaker. History forgot him almost immediately, distracted by the more dramatic figures who surrounded him. But the document he sent to Constantinople on that September evening, without fanfare, without triumph, without apparent understanding that the gesture would define an era. That document belongs to him. The ruins were still standing when he left them. That was not nothing. Chapter 5. Theodoric the Great, the king who almost rebuilt Rome. Begin with a boy of 8 years old in a city he has never seen before. He has been taken from his family in the Middle Danube region and brought to the most magnificent city in the world to live as a hostage in the imperial palace. He is not mistreated in any physical sense. He will be housed alongside the children of the Roman nobility, given access to Roman education, taught Latin and Greek, introduced to the full apparatus of Roman learning, Roman law, Roman administration, Roman ceremony. He will eat Roman food and wear Roman clothing and attend events in the hippodrome where 100,000 people watch chariot races under the shadow of monuments that have stood for generations. He will spend 10 years here, absorbing a civilization so thoroughly that it becomes part of how he thinks, part of what he believes civilization is supposed to look like, part of what he will spend the rest of his life trying to build. His name is Theodoric. His father is the king of the Ostrogoths, and the decade he spends in Constantinople will shape everything he does, in ways that are sometimes magnificent and, ultimately, in the most heartbreaking way possible, tragic. The practice of taking high-born children as hostages was a standard instrument of Roman diplomacy. It served immediate and practical purposes. It gave Rome a guarantee of the host family's good behavior, but it also, over time, produced something Rome may not have fully intended. It produced men who had been shaped by Roman culture deeply enough to genuinely believe in Roman ideals, but who had never been allowed to fully become Roman, who had been formed by the empire and then returned to their own people, carrying that formation like a gift and a wound simultaneously. Theodoric returned to the Ostrogoths around 479. After his father's death made his presence among his people necessary. He was approximately 25 years old. He spoke Latin. He understood Roman administrative practice. He had been given Roman military titles that he regarded as genuine recognition of his worth and his people's worth. He had, in the deepest possible sense, been educated to love a world that had kept him at arm's length. What followed over the next decade was a complex negotiation conducted by force, as Theodoric led the Ostrogoths through the Balkans, seeking the kind of settlement and formal recognition that the Roman education and the Roman titles had, in his understanding, earned his people. The Eastern Emperor Zeno had his own reasons for wanting the Ostrogoths occupied elsewhere. The offer he eventually made was elegant in its strategy. Go to Italy, remove Odoacer, govern the peninsula in the name of the Eastern Court, maintaining Roman institutions and Roman law, while operating with practical independence. Theodoric accepted, and in 488 he led the Ostrogoths west. The war against Odoacer lasted nearly 4 years. Odoacer was not a weak opponent and defended Italy through a series of engagements that went back and forth long enough that the outcome was genuinely uncertain for an extended period. Theodoric eventually negotiated a settlement, an arrangement of shared rule to be concluded with a formal banquet in Ravenna in 493. At that banquet, Theodoric killed Odoacer with his own hands. The ancient sources describe the act as deliberate. Whether the negotiation had always been a calculated trap, or whether something in the moment itself provoked the action, the sources do not allow us to determine with certainty. What is clear is that the killing was personal, that Theodoric did it himself, and that it was followed by the systematic elimination of Odoacer's supporters. It was a brutal beginning for a reign that would, in its long middle decades, become genuinely remarkable. What Theodoric built in Italy over the next 30 years was impressive by any honest assessment. He governed a kingdom in which the Gothic military population and the Roman civilian population lived under a dual system that was, by the standards of the age, unusually thoughtful. Goths handled military matters. Romans handled civil administration. Roman law applied to the Roman population. Gothic customary practice applied to the Goths. Disputes between the communities were handled by special arrangements designed to give both sides access to appropriate legal frameworks. The Roman Senate continued to function. Roman aristocrats continued to hold high administrative positions. The infrastructure of Roman Italy, the roads, the aqueducts, the drainage systems of the Po Valley, received maintenance, and in some cases, real improvement. Theodoric corresponded with the Eastern Emperor and with the Visigothic kings of Spain as something approaching an equal, building a diplomatic network that gave the Ostrogothic kingdom genuine standing in the post-Roman world. The cultural life of his court was built around the finest Roman learning available. The most important figure in this context was a man named Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius, and he deserves more than a passing mention. Boethius came from one of the most distinguished families in Rome, a family whose connection to Roman senatorial tradition stretched back centuries. He was, by the evidence of what he produced, one of the finest minds of the age. He translated Greek philosophical texts into Latin, making the works of Aristotle and others accessible to a Western audience that could no longer read Greek fluently. He wrote original works on mathematics, music theory, and logic that became foundational texts in medieval education, and he served Theodoric's government as Master of Offices, effectively the head of the civilian administration, a position that required the combination of scholarly ability and practical governance that Boethius possessed in unusual measure. For 30 years, the arrangement worked. Imperfectly, but genuinely. Then, in the final years of Theodoric's reign, something broke. The trigger was deteriorating relations between Ravenna and Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor, Justin I, who came to power in 518, pursued religious policies that increased pressure on Arian Christians throughout the Roman world, including Theodoric's Gothic people. The theological distinction between Arianism and the Nicene Christianity of the imperial church, which had been managed as a tolerable difference for decades, suddenly had sharper political edges. Theodoric began to see conspiracy where previously he had seen cooperation. He turned against the people who had made his kingdom work. Boethius was accused of treason, specifically of conducting treasonous correspondence with Constantinople. The accusation came from political enemies and is regarded by most historians who have examined it as almost certainly false. A man who had devoted his career to serving the Gothic kingdom in good faith, who had been honoured with its highest civilian offices, who had every reason to value the arrangement Theodoric had built, was accused of plotting against it by men who had reasons to want him removed. Theodoric had him imprisoned, then executed, sometime around 524, in the cell in Pavia where he waited for death. Boethius wrote a book. The Consolation of Philosophy is a dialogue between the imprisoned Boethius and a personified figure of philosophy, who visits him to discuss the nature of fortune, fate, free will, and the good. It draws on Platonic and Stoic traditions to argue that true good cannot be taken away by the reversals of fortune, however extreme those reversals may be. Written by a man awaiting execution for crimes he almost certainly did not commit, by candlelight in a cell in a city that had once celebrated him, it has a weight that purely academic philosophy rarely achieves. It became one of the most widely read books of the entire medieval period. King Alfred of England translated it into Old English in the 9th century. Chaucer engaged with it in the 14th century. Dante placed Boethius in Paradise. It was read, copied, and drawn upon by thinkers across more than 1,000 years of European intellectual history. The man who ordered the execution of the person who wrote it died within a year of doing so, reportedly troubled in his final months by guilt and visions. According to later sources that may be shaping the narrative with retrospective moral judgment, Theodoric's immediate successors could not maintain what he had built. The Ostrogothic kingdom lasted another 30 years after his death before being destroyed by Justinian's Reconquest. A conflict so brutal and so extended that it left Italy more damaged than anything the preceding century of political change had produced. But Theodoric remains one of the most compelling figures of the entire post-Roman period, precisely because of the distance between what he built and how he ended it. He had been educated as a Roman and governed, for most of his reign, in ways that honoured that education. He had come closer than almost anyone else of his era to demonstrating that a Germanic king could maintain Roman institutions, protect Roman learning, and govern a genuinely mixed population with real sophistication. And then, in his final years, he destroyed his own answer. He killed the man who had made his kingdom worth governing. He died, haunted, by the accounts of those who remembered him, not by the enemies he had defeated, but by the ally he had murdered. Boethius, in his cell, writing about the consolations available to someone that fortune had abandoned, was composing one of the great texts of Western civilization. He was also, without knowing it, writing the eulogy of the king who had ordered his death. Both of them had built something worth having. Both of them lost it in the end. The ruins they left behind were more complicated than simple ruins. They were the remains of something that had almost worked, and almost, in the long perspective of history, is sometimes the most heartbreaking distance of all. Chapter 6. The Vandals' History's Most misunderstood villains. Say the word Vandal to anyone in the modern world, and they will tell you what it means without hesitation. Someone who destroys things without reason. Someone who smashes what others have built. Defaces what others have made beautiful. Leaves wreckage in place of order. The word appears in police reports and insurance claims and frustrated conversations about graffiti on public walls. And almost everyone who uses it has no idea. It refers to a specific people who lived in a specific place at a specific time, whose actual history bears almost no resemblance to the meaning the word has acquired. The gap between the Vandals of history and the Vandals of everyday language is one of the most instructive examples in the entire post-Roman period of how thoroughly a defeated people can be replaced by a caricature. The Vandals originated in what is now Poland and Eastern Germany. Like most of the peoples in this story, they had complex and long-standing relationships with Rome, serving in Roman armies, trading across the frontier, absorbing elements of Roman culture over generations. Their journey from those origins to the place where they built their kingdom traces one of the most extraordinary geographic movements of the entire migration period. It began in earnest in the first years of the 5th century. A combination of Hunnic pressure from the east and instability along the Rhine frontier created an opening that multiple Germanic groups moved through simultaneously. The Rhine River froze in the winter of 405 to 406, depending on which scholarly chronology one follows, and groups including the Vandals crossed the ice into Roman Gaul, overwhelming the frontier defences that had held for generations. What followed was not an organised invasion in any strategic sense. It was the chaotic movement of large populations into territory that could not absorb them peacefully, producing violence and displacement across a wide area of Gaul over several years. The Vandals moved through Gaul into Spain, where they spent roughly 2 decades continuing to fight other groups, including the Visigoths, also pressing into the peninsula, and then, in 429, made the crossing that would define their historical legacy. Under a king named Genseric, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. Genseric is not a name that most people know, which is itself a form of historical injustice, because he was, by any honest assessment, one of the most strategically capable rulers of the 5th century. The North Africa he entered was one of the wealthiest regions of the entire Roman world. Its grain fields fed significant portions of the Western Empire. Its cities were prosperous. Its trading networks connected it to every corner of the Mediterranean. Control of North Africa meant, in practical terms, leverage over Rome itself. Genseric understood this with a clarity that his subsequent decisions make unmistakable. He took Carthage, the greatest city of North Africa and the administrative capital of the region, in 439. The taking was by negotiation and relatively orderly occupation rather than by assault. Genseric was interested in having Carthage function, not in reducing it to rubble. A functioning Carthage, with its harbour and its grain trade intact, was the foundation of a Mediterranean naval power. That is exactly what he built. The Vandal fleet that developed from Carthage became the dominant naval force in the Western Mediterranean for nearly a generation. Vandal ships ranged across the sea, raiding coasts that had never needed naval defences because Rome had always controlled the water. The Eastern and Western Roman empires launched multiple naval expeditions against Genseric and failed, sometimes catastrophically. A massive joint expedition in 468, one of the largest naval operations of the 5th century, was destroyed by Vandal fireships in an engagement that ended any serious Roman attempt to retake North Africa for a generation. Now come to the event that gave the Vandals their permanent and distorted place in the language. In 455, the Western Emperor Valentinian III was assassinated, creating a succession crisis in Ravenna. Genseric had political grievances related to marriage alliances that the assassination had disrupted. He sailed to Italy with his fleet and arrived outside Rome. Pope Leo I went out to meet him. The details of what Leo and Genseric agreed to are not entirely preserved in the sources. What is clear from multiple ancient accounts, including sources hostile to the Vandals, is that Genseric entered Rome and spent 14 days there. He took an enormous quantity of portable wealth: gold, silver, bronze statues, the accumulated treasures of centuries. He took prisoners, including members of the imperial family. These were real and serious acts with devastating consequences for the people who experienced them directly. None of that should be minimized. What he did not do, according to the consistent testimony of the ancient sources, is equally important for understanding what actually happened. He did not burn the city. He did not massacre the population. He did not systematically destroy the public buildings, the churches, the infrastructure that made Rome a functioning city. The sources that describe the event, including those writing from a perspective deeply sympathetic to Rome and hostile to the Vandals, do not describe the kind of indiscriminate destruction that the word vandalism implies. It was a sack, with the chaos and human cost that word implies. But the gap between what actually happened and what the word vandalism suggests is enormous. And that gap is worth examining closely. Who built the narrative that filled that gap? And why did it stick so completely? The Vandal kingdom of North Africa lasted until 534, when it was destroyed by the armies of Justinian under the general Belisarius. The conquest was swift and relatively complete. The last Vandal king was captured and taken to Constantinople. The Vandal aristocracy was dispersed. The kingdom ceased to exist as a political entity within a short period. When a people disappear from the political map that completely, their history is written entirely by others. The writers who shaped the historical memory of the Vandals were Romans and Byzantine successors, who had every reason to emphasize the destructive aspects of Vandal activity and no reason to complicate that emphasis with context. The Vandals were not present to offer their own account. Their literary tradition, if they maintained one, has not survived. The word vandalism did not enter common use in its modern meaning until the 18th century, when a French bishop named Henri Grégoire used it during the French Revolution to describe the destruction of artwork, deliberately invoking the Vandals as a historical symbol of destructive irrationality. Grégoire's usage was polemical rather than historical. It was effective because the Vandal reputation had already been shaped by centuries of hostile sources into something that served the rhetorical purpose he needed. What this history suggests, and most historians examining the period would agree, is that the narrative of Vandal destruction was built and maintained primarily by the people who defeated them. That does not make it entirely false. It makes it incomplete, shaped by the interests and perspectives of those who survived to do the writing. The actual Vandals built a functioning Mediterranean kingdom that lasted a century. They developed a naval power that neither half of the Roman Empire could easily defeat. They governed North Africa with enough stability that the region continued to function economically through their rule. Genseric was, by most serious measures, a more capable strategic thinker than the majority of the Western Roman emperors who preceded and followed him. None of that made it into the word that carries their name. The lesson is not that the Vandals were admirable in all respects, or that the people who suffered at their hands experienced anything other than genuine hardship. The lesson is simpler and more uncomfortable. When a people are defeated completely enough that they cannot write their own history, the only history they get is the one their enemies wrote. That history will reflect the purposes of the people who wrote it. And the word that carries the Vandals into everyday language is a monument to that process. A characterization codified over centuries by people with reasons to characterize and no one left to object. They crossed half a continent. They built a kingdom on the shores of Africa. They made the Mediterranean unsafe for Roman fleets for a generation. And then they lost. And the victors named something ugly after them. That is how it goes. Sometimes. When you end up on the wrong side of the last battle. Chapter 7. The Franks from Forest Tribes to Empire Builders. There is a winter evening in the last years of the 5th century when a bishop named Remigius stands in a church in the city of Reims and prepares to baptize a king. The church is not grand by Roman standards. The congregation is a mix of Frankish warriors and Gallo-Roman clergy, two worlds that have been circling each other warily for a generation. United tonight by a ceremony, both sides understand will change things, though neither side can say exactly how. The torches smoke. The water in the baptismal font is cold. The king is Clovis I, ruler of the Franks. He has been the most militarily effective leader in Gaul for a decade, expanding Frankish territory through a combination of force, alliance, and political intelligence that his rivals have consistently underestimated. He is not, by the standards of the late Roman world, a particularly pious man. He is a man who has been thinking carefully about a decision that will shape everything that follows. His wife, Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who has been a Nicene Christian since before their marriage, has been working toward this moment for years. She had their children baptized over Clovis's initial resistance. She argued with him about faith in terms specific enough to suggest real conversations rather than invented theology. She was, by the evidence of what she accomplished and the way she is remembered, a woman of genuine conviction and real persistence. Someone who understood that the question she was putting to her husband was not only about faith, but about the future of the kingdom she had married into. The account of the conversion that Bishop Gregory of Tours wrote nearly a century later describes a battlefield moment. Clovis calling on the Christian God when his forces were losing against the Alemanni, promising conversion if the battle turned. The battle turned. Whether this moment happened exactly as Gregory describes is a question that honest historians acknowledge cannot be resolved. Gregory was writing hagiography as much as history, constructing a providential narrative for purposes that served the Frankish church of his own day. What is not seriously disputed is the fact of the conversion itself and the immediate political intelligence of the choice Clovis made. Because the choice was not simply between Christianity and paganism, it was between two versions of Christianity that carried very different political implications. The Arian Christianity that most other Germanic kingdoms had adopted, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, was regarded as heretical by the Bishop of Rome and by the Roman population of the former Western Empire. The Nicene Christianity, favoured by the Roman Church, was the faith of the majority of the people that any Germanic king in Gaul needed to govern effectively. Clovis chose Nicene Christianity. He chose the faith of Rome, of the bishops, of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, whose cooperation he required, of the Pope, whose recognition could confer a legitimacy that military victory alone could not provide. This was a political calculation. It was also, by the evidence of how Clovis practiced his faith in the years following his conversion, a genuine commitment. The two things are not contradictory. They are, in fact, how most consequential decisions at the intersection of faith and power have actually been made throughout history. The calculation and the conviction arrive together and cannot be cleanly separated afterward. The consequences were immediate and significant. The Frankish alliance with the Roman Church gave Clovis something no other Germanic king in the West possessed in the same form. The active support of the episcopal establishment in the territories he ruled and sought to rule. The bishops of Gaul were among the most powerful and educated men in their communities. They controlled significant resources. Their cooperation was essential to governing effectively in a world where the church was often the only institution providing continuity across political disruption. Clovis used this alliance with decisive effect. He campaigned against the Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul, framing the war partly as a conflict between Orthodox and Arian Christianity, and gaining Gallo-Roman support on those grounds. His victory at the Battle of Vui in 507 drove the Visigoths largely out of Gaul and into Spain, establishing Frankish dominance over most of what is now France. The Eastern Emperor, Anastasius, sent him the symbols of an honorary Roman consulship, a gesture whose practical significance was limited but whose symbolic weight was considerable. A Frankish king, who had been a pagan a decade earlier, was now receiving recognition from Constantinople. Clovis died in 511. He was buried in Paris, in a church he had founded, and the dynasty he established, known to historians as the Merovingian dynasty, would rule the Frankish world for the next 2.5 centuries. The Merovingian period is not a story of steady progress. It is a story of a kingdom repeatedly divided among the sons of dead kings, according to Frankish inheritance customs, that treated the realm as personal property to be split like any other estate. The violence this generated was real and frequent. Fratricide, assassination, and the systematic elimination of rival claimants were recurring features of Merovingian political life. To understand what this violence actually looked like from the inside, and what it cost the people who lived through it, consider the lives of two women whose conflict dominated Frankish politics for 4 decades. Brunhilde came from the Visigothic royal family of Spain. Educated in a court culture, more sophisticated than the Frankish one she entered when she married King Sigebert, the first of Austrasia, in the 560s, she had been formed by a world that valued literacy, legal tradition, and administrative capability, and she brought all of those things to the Frankish court. She built and maintained roads in the territories under her control, a practical act of governance that preserved Roman infrastructure in ways that mattered enormously for the communities living along those roads. She corresponded with Pope Gregory I on matters of church organization, conducting herself in those letters as an equal participant in the governance of the Western Church. She governed as regent for her son after Sigebert's assassination and then for her grandsons after her son's death, maintaining the cohesion of the Austrasian kingdom through transitions that might otherwise have fragmented it. Her husband was murdered in 575, killed by agents acting at the direction of his sister-in-law Fredegund. Fredegund came from a background the sources describe as common rather than noble, a liability she overcame through intelligence, absolute ruthlessness, and the complete confidence of King Chilperic, whose favour she had obtained and retained with an effectiveness that speaks to real personal capability. Whatever one thinks of the methods attributed to her, the sources, which are mostly hostile to her, attribute to her a series of political murders spanning decades. Whether all of these attributions are accurate, or whether some represent hostile projection onto a woman who was simply more formidable than her enemies found comfortable, is a question the sources do not resolve cleanly. What is not seriously disputed is that she was a genuine and significant political operator whose influence on Frankish affairs extended well beyond what her formal position should have allowed. The conflict between them was conducted through husbands, son, allies, and assassins across 4 decades. It was fought over the structure of Frankish royal authority, over which branch of the Merovingian dynasty would control the resources and alliances that determined who governed effectively. It was personal and political simultaneously. in the way that conflicts between people with real stakes in real outcomes always are. It ended in 613 when Fredegund's son, Clotaire II, captured Brunhilde after a military victory and executed her. She was approximately 70 years old. She had governed portions of the Frankish world, by most reasonable assessments, for nearly 40 years. What she received in return was the most humiliating death the victorious side could devise. A public degradation intended to make clear what happened to women who wielded power on the scale she had wielded it. Stay with that for a moment. A woman of 70, who had maintained a kingdom across the reigns of 3 generations of kings, who had built roads and written to popes, and kept the eastern Frankish territories functioning through decades of internal warfare, was executed in a manner designed primarily to humiliate the political threat she represented. Even in defeat, was apparently large enough to require not just removal, but a statement. History rarely pauses long enough on moments like this to let their full weight land. By the late 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become increasingly ceremonial figures, while real power had shifted to the mayor of the palace, the chief administrator, who in practice controlled the kingdom's resources and military forces. The family that held this position, the family historians would eventually call the Carolingians, built their power gradually through military effectiveness, strategic marriages, and the accumulation of land holdings that gave them an economic base independent of any royal grant. The moment that established their military reputation beyond challenge came in 732. A force from the Umayyad Caliphate, part of the expansion that had swept across North Africa and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom in Spain within a few years of 711, moved north into what had been Frankish territory in Gaul. The extent and ultimate ambition of this movement are questions historians have discussed at length. Whether it represented a serious attempt to push deep into Europe or was primarily a large-scale raiding expedition is debated, and the long-term significance of what followed has been described with varying levels of drama by writers across the centuries since. What is not seriously disputed is that a Frankish force under the command of Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace and grandfather of Charlemagne, defeated the Umayyad force near Tours in 732, and that the Umayyad expansion into Gaul did not proceed further after that battle. The battle stands as one of the most symbolically significant military engagements of the period, representing a moment when Frankish military power checked an external force of the first magnitude, even if historians continue to debate the full scope of what a different outcome might have meant. Charles Martel's son, Pippin III, took the final step the Carolingians had been moving toward for a generation. In 751, with formal papal blessing, he deposed the last Merovingian king and claimed the Frankish throne himself. The dynasty that Clovis had founded was over. The dynasty that would produce the most ambitious attempt to rebuild Rome was beginning. Before following that story to its culmination, stay with this one moment from Clovis's reign. After the victory at Vui in 507, after the Visigoths had been driven south and the Frankish kingdom had expanded to cover most of Gaul, Clovis received the envoys from Constantinople bearing his honorary consulship. He put on the purple robe and the gold crown and rode through the streets of Tours while the crowd cheered. It is a small scene. It does not appear in most histories of the period, but it captures something essential about what the Franks had accomplished that no other Germanic kingdom had quite managed. Here was a man who had come to power as the leader of a tribal people with no Roman inheritance, standing in the city that housed the tomb of Saint Martin, the greatest saint of Gaul, wearing the symbols of the civilization he had chosen to align himself with, receiving recognition from the emperor who sat in Constantinople and traced his authority back to Augustus. The church that had blessed his baptism was still there. The emperor who had honored his victory was still there. The saint whose tomb had organized the religious life of Western Gaul for a century, was still there. When individual kings died and kingdoms divided, those things remained. That is what Clovis had bought with his decision at the baptismal font. Not just a political alliance, a foundation that would outlast him by centuries. Chapter 8. Justinian's Reconquest. Rome strikes back. There is a city in the 6th century that has refused, with a stubbornness bordering on theological conviction, to accept that Rome is finished. It sits on a triangular peninsula where 2 seas meet, protected by water on 3 sides and by walls that would withstand most sieges for centuries. Its streets are full of Greek, but its government speaks Latin. Its emperor wears Roman purple, sits on a Roman throne, and traces his authority in an unbroken line back to Augustus. It has its own senate, its own hippodrome, its own monuments deliberately designed to echo and rival those of the city on the Tiber. Its name is Constantinople, and in the 520s, it acquires a ruler who is constitutionally incapable of accepting that the western half of the world his predecessors once commanded belongs to anyone but him. His name is Justinian I. He was born around 482 in a small town in what is now North Macedonia, the son of a peasant family whose native language was Latin rather than Greek, connecting him to an older Roman administrative tradition in a court that had become increasingly Greek in its daily life. His uncle Justin had risen through the military to become emperor, and Justinian had been brought to Constantinople as a young man, educated at the imperial court, and prepared carefully for a role in the administration. When Justin died in 527 with no sons of his own, Justinian became emperor at approximately 45 years old. He would reign for 38 years. He would spend most of them trying to put the Roman world back together. But before the campaigns and the law codes and the great church that still stands in Istanbul today, there is something that needs to be understood about the woman, without whom almost none of it would have happened in the way it did. Theodora grew up in the world of the Constantinople hippodrome, the daughter of a bear keeper, and she had worked as a performer in her youth in occupations that carried significant social stigma in Byzantine society, to the point that existing law prohibited senators from marrying women of her background. Justinian changed the law to marry her. She became empress of what remained of the Roman world, and she turned out to be one of the most formidable political intelligences of the 6th century. The moment that demonstrates this most clearly came in 532, 18 months into the reign, during a crisis that nearly ended everything before it properly began. A riot in Constantinople, growing from conflicts between the hippodrome racing factions into something far larger and more dangerous, had escalated into a full-scale urban uprising. Rebels had set fire to large portions of the city. They were proclaiming a rival emperor in the streets. Justinian and his senior advisors were in the palace in genuine panic. The ships readied in the harbour for flight. The situation apparently irretrievable. Theodora spoke. The account, preserved by the historian Procopius, gives her a speech arguing that flight was beneath the dignity of the position they held, that an emperor who fled was no emperor, that she for her part preferred to die wearing the purple rather than survive as a refugee. The exact words Procopius records are shaped by his literary purposes and should not be taken as a verbatim transcript. What is not disputed is the outcome. Justinian stayed. His generals moved. The rebellion was suppressed with significant bloodshed in the hippodrome. The reign continued. Theodora governed alongside her husband for the next 21 years until her death in 548. She was not a figurehead. She had genuine influence over appointments, over religious policy, over the handling of theological disputes that consumed enormous political energy in the 6th century church. She corresponded with foreign rulers independently. She protected individuals who had lost Justinian's favour. There is a mosaic in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, completed around 547, while Theodora was still alive, that shows her in full imperial regalia, her face direct and unsmiling, the hemline of her robe decorated with the three magi bearing gifts to the Christ child. She is presented not as the emperor's consort but as an imperial figure in her own right, accorded the same ceremonial weight as Justinian in the companion mosaic on the opposite wall. The artists who made that mosaic were working under imperial commission. They knew exactly what they were saying about the woman they were depicting. She knew what she was. The mosaic knew what she was. Now to the campaigns. Justinian's reconquest of the West did not begin as a grand strategic vision. It began with an opportunity created by someone else's political crisis. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa in 533 was in the middle of a succession dispute. The legitimate king, Hilderic, who had maintained reasonable relations with Constantinople, had been deposed by his cousin Gelimer. Justinian used this as a pretext, framing his campaign as a legitimate intervention to restore order and protect the Roman and Nicene Christian population of North Africa, which had experienced religious pressure under Vandal Arian rule. The general he chose was Belisarius, a man in his late 20s who had already demonstrated unusual military ability in campaigns on the eastern frontier. What Belisarius accomplished in North Africa over the following year was extraordinary by any honest measure. He landed with a force modest by Roman historical standards, maneuvered with a speed and intelligence that kept the Vandals consistently off balance, and within 12 months the Vandal kingdom had been destroyed. Gelimer had surrendered, and North Africa was back under imperial control for the first time in nearly a century. The speed of the victory reflected several realities. The Vandal kingdom had declined significantly from the formidable power it had been under Genseric. The Roman population of North Africa showed limited enthusiasm for defending the regime that had governed them for a century, and Belisarius was simply a better commander than the men opposing him. Justinian celebrated with a triumph in Constantinople, displaying Gelimer and the treasures of the Vandal kingdom to the city's population. Among the treasures, according to the sources, were the sacred vessels originally taken from Jerusalem by the Emperor Titus, which had passed from Rome to Carthage when the Vandals sacked Rome in 455 and now came to Constantinople. Procopius records that a Jewish elder warned Justinian that these objects carried a history of misfortune for whoever possessed them, and that Justinian sent them to the churches of Jerusalem. Whether this exchange happened as described cannot be verified, but it captures something genuine about how the movement of these objects across centuries resonated with the people who witnessed it. The Italian campaign was a different story entirely. The pretext was the murder of the Ostrogothic queen regent, Amalasuntha, daughter of Theodoric, who had governed wisely as regent for her young son and maintained friendly relations with Constantinople, and who was killed in 535 by Gothic aristocrats who resented her pro-Roman orientation. Justinian declared that justice required a response. Belisarius invaded Sicily in 535, crossed to the Italian mainland, and initially advanced with remarkable speed. Naples fell after a difficult siege. Rome was entered in 536 without a pitched battle, the Ostrogothic garrison withdrawing rather than defending it. Belisarius entered the city that had been the center of the Western world and found it diminished but recognizable, still inhabited, still functioning in its reduced post-imperial form. What followed was not a rapid reconquest. It was a war that lasted nearly 20 years and consumed Italy in ways that the relatively stable Gothic period had not. The Ostrogoths regrouped under new leadership and laid siege to Rome itself from 537 to 538. A siege of over a year that Belisarius defended with a force significantly smaller than the besieging army. He held the city, but at a cost. The aqueducts, supplying Rome with clean water, were cut by the Goths as a practical military measure, a decision whose long-term consequences for the city were severe and lasting. The population of Rome, already significantly diminished from its imperial peak, declined further during the years of intermittent warfare. Belisarius won major engagements and was then recalled to Constantinople. Sent back. Recalled again. The pattern was one that talented generals serving suspicious emperors have always known. He was given enough support to continue the war, but not consistently enough to end it. Kept in a state of dependency on imperial resupply and imperial favor that limited his ability to achieve decisive results on his own terms. There was a moment, sometime in the early 540s, when this dynamic reached its most painful point. Belisarius was holding a precarious position in Italy with forces he knew were inadequate. He wrote to Constantinople, describing the situation with a frankness that his position barely allowed. He laid out what he needed. He described what was at stake. He asked for the reinforcements without which the campaign could not be concluded, and the country they were supposedly liberating could not be saved from the war that was destroying it. He waited. The response that came promised reinforcements. The reinforcements arrived slowly, in quantities that never quite matched what the situation required. Justinian valued Belisarius's talent and feared his independence simultaneously. And that combination produced exactly the kind of grinding, inconclusive warfare that was destroying the country both of them were trying to save. A general writing letters that he knew might not be fully believed. Asking for resources he knew might not fully arrive. Doing his best with what he had in a country that was paying the price for decisions made in a palace 1,000 miles away. That is the human face of Justinian's great reconquest. And it is worth holding alongside the triumphs and the law codes. The war was finally ended not by Belisarius, but by another general, Narses, who destroyed the last significant Ostrogothic resistance in 554. By that point, the Italy that had been reconquered was measurably worse off than the Italy the Ostrogoths had governed. Population had declined. Agriculture had been disrupted. Cities that had survived a century of political change had been besieged and resieged until some of them were shadows of what they had been. The military achievement was genuine. The human cost was devastating. Justinian's other great accomplishment, less dramatic than the campaigns, but ultimately more durable, was the codification of Roman law that he commissioned in the early years of his reign. The legal traditions of Rome had accumulated over 1,000 years into a body of texts, precedents, commentaries, and conflicting interpretations of such complexity that even trained lawyers found it difficult to navigate consistently. Justinian commissioned a team of legal scholars, led by a jurist named Tribonian, to compile, organize, and where necessary, reconcile this material into a coherent system. The result, the Corpus Juris Civilis, meaning the body of civil law, became one of the most consequential legal compilations in the history of Western civilization. It organized Roman legal thinking into a form that could be transmitted, studied, and applied across very different social and political contexts. When European universities began studying law systematically in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was Justinian's compilation they worked with. When the legal codes of France, Germany, Spain, and Italy were written in the modern era, they drew on traditions that ran through that compilation back to the classical Roman legal tradition. The Corpus Juris Civilis outlasted the empire that produced it by more than 1,000 years. It is still in the legal DNA of most of continental Europe today. Then came the plague, In 541, a disease appeared in Egypt and spread with terrifying speed across the Mediterranean world. The symptoms, described by contemporary sources, match closely enough with what later centuries would experience during the Black Death that most historians identify it as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Genetic evidence from burial sites, examined in recent decades, has confirmed this identification, while also establishing that the 6th century strain was related to, but distinct from, the 14th century pandemic strain. The plague of Justinian struck Constantinople in 542, while Justinian was directing the Italian campaign. He contracted the disease himself and survived. Theodora managed the imperial government during his illness. An unremarkable administrative fact in a reign where her role in governance was never merely ceremonial. The demographic impact of the plague is one of the genuinely contested questions of 6th century history. Earlier estimates suggesting it killed a quarter to half the population of affected areas have been revised downward by more recent scholarship examining both the textual and biological evidence. Some researchers now argue that the earlier estimates significantly overstated the mortality and that the plague, while genuinely devastating, was more geographically and temporally concentrated than the most dramatic accounts suggest. The honest position is that the scale of mortality remains uncertain, but that the plague caused substantial damage to the economic and social fabric of the Mediterranean world, at a moment when that fabric was already under severe strain from the costs of the Reconquest. Justinian died in 565. He had reigned for 38 years. He had rebuilt the great church of Hagia Sophia after the original was burned during the early revolt, producing a structure whose dome engineering was so advanced that it influenced ecclesiastical architecture for centuries, and that still stands in Istanbul today. He had compiled the legal tradition of Rome into a form that would survive the empire by a millennium. He had reconquered territories his successors could not hold. The question his reign poses is not comfortable. Was the Reconquest worth it? The Italy Justinian reconquered was more damaged by the process of reconquest than it had been by the Gothic rule that preceded it. The resources spent on Western campaigns weakened the empire's capacity to defend its eastern frontiers, contributing to vulnerabilities that the Arab conquests of the following century would exploit with devastating effect. The territories reconquered proved difficult to hold. North Africa lasted over a century under imperial rule before the Arab conquests swept it away permanently. Italy fell largely to the Lombards within a generation of the war's end. And yet, the law code survived. Hagia Sophia still stands. The idea that Roman legal tradition was worth preserving and transmitting to the future in a form that later centuries could build upon, and the massive institutional effort required to actually do it, represented something of lasting value that would not have taken the form it did without Justinian. The man who tried to put Rome back together succeeded in preserving the most important part of what Rome had been, and failed to preserve the part that was already beyond saving. Whether he understood the difference in the moment is a different question entirely. History rarely gives its participants that kind of clarity. It only looks obvious afterward. Chapter 9. The Lombards, last of the invaders, most enduring of legacies. There is a farmer in the Po Valley in the year 568 who has spent his life in fields his family has worked for generations. He has lived through the Gothic Wars, which means he has lived through armies crossing his land in both directions, through harvests disrupted and livestock requisitioned, and neighbours who did not survive the decade. He has watched the imperial forces arrive as liberators and then watched them prove unable to defend what they claimed to have liberated. He has rebuilt what could be rebuilt and accepted the loss of what could not. Now there are new soldiers coming over the Alps from the north. He does not know their name yet. He does not know that they will still be here 150 years from now, that the region his grandchildren farm will carry their name for the next 15 centuries and beyond. He knows only that his valley is in their path, and that the empire that was supposed to protect him from exactly this has nothing left to offer. The Lombards, who crossed the Alps into Italy in 568, were moving into a landscape that the Gothic wars had left exhausted in ways that went well beyond military defeat. Population had declined across the peninsula. Agricultural production had been disrupted in regions that had served as extended military theatres. The cities that had functioned as centres of administration and economic life under the Ostrogoths had suffered during years of siege and counter-siege. The imperial forces left to defend Italy after the end of the Gothic War were insufficient in numbers and irregular in their payment, a problem that would plague Byzantine military administration in Italy throughout the period that followed. The Lombards themselves had been moving for generations before they arrived at the Alps. Their origins lay in what is now northwestern Germany and Denmark, and they had spent several generations in the Middle Danube region, fighting and allying with various groups. Before the combination of opportunity in Italy and growing pressure from the Avars, a new step, people arriving from the east, prompted their decisive southward movement. Their king, when they entered Italy, was named Alboin, and around him accumulated the kind of legend that attaches to figures of particular ferocity and personal drama. He had defeated the Gepid people in the years before the Italian crossing, killing their king Cunimund in battle. According to sources writing after the fact, he made a drinking cup from Cunimund's skull, a practice described in other warrior cultures of the period that may reflect a real custom or may represent the kind of story that accumulates around ruthless leaders. He had also married Cunimund's daughter, Rosamund, in the diplomatic practice common to the age. The story that follows is one of the more dramatic personal episodes of the Lombard period. At a feast in Verona, Alboin reportedly compelled Rosamund to drink from her father's skull. Whether this happened exactly as the sources describe or represents elaboration around a real offence, Rosamund arranged Alboin's assassination in 572. She fled to Ravenna, and her own subsequent fate was equally violent. The story matters not only for its drama, it illuminates something real about the Lombard world, a society organized around warrior culture and personal honor in ways that made the king's relationship with his own nobility precarious, and in which women, despite formal subordination, could exercise lethal agency in the spaces that formal structures left open. The Lombard occupation of Italy was fragmentary in ways that distinguished it sharply from the Ostrogothic period. The Lombards never controlled all of Italy. Byzantine forces held Ravenna and its surrounding territories, the city of Rome and its hinterland, significant portions of southern Italy, and various coastal areas. The result was an Italy divided between Lombard-controlled territories in the north and centre and Byzantine-controlled areas in the south and east. A division that would shape Italian political geography for centuries, and whose traces can be argued to persist in the economic and cultural differences between regions of Italy that are still discussed today. The Lombard kingdom itself was further fragmented between the central royal authority at Pavia and semi-independent duchies, particularly the Dukes of Spoleto and Benevento controlling large territories in central and southern Italy, who operated with a degree of local autonomy that made coordinated Lombard policy consistently difficult to achieve. This fragmentation had a paradoxical consequence for the survival of Roman culture. Where a unified and powerful Lombard state might have imposed a more complete transformation of Italian institutions, the fragmented reality meant that Roman urban structures, church organization, and administrative practices survived in the spaces between Lombard power centers, The church was the most important surviving institution, and the figure who most clearly embodied its growing capacity to fill the vacuum left by weakened, secular governance was a man named Gregory, elected Bishop of Rome in 590. Known to history as Gregory the Great. Gregory came from a distinguished Roman senatorial family. He had served in the secular administration of the city before entering religious life, giving him a practical understanding of governance that most of his predecessors as Bishop of Rome had not possessed. He became Pope at a moment of genuine crisis, with Lombard forces periodically threatening Rome. The imperial government in Constantinople, too distant and too preoccupied to provide reliable protection, and the economic infrastructure of the city under severe strain. Gregory responded by doing what the situation required, regardless of whether the formal authority for it clearly rested with his office. He organized the defense of Rome. He negotiated directly with Lombard dukes when the imperial government could not or would not. He managed the estates of the Roman Church to provide grain and basic necessities to the city's population. He sent missionaries to Britain, including the Augustin, who would eventually convert the Kentish king and establish the See of Canterbury. He conducted a foreign policy of his own, corresponding with rulers across the post-Roman world in ways that established the Bishop of Rome as a figure of international consequence, independent of whatever secular authority might nominally oversee the city. What Gregory demonstrated, through 2 decades of governance under impossible conditions, was that the Roman Church had become something more than a religious institution. It had become a governing power, with territories, economic resources, diplomatic relationships, and the practical capacity to protect populations when secular rulers could not. That transformation was not planned. It happened because the collapse of effective secular governance created needs that the Church was the only institution positioned to meet. The Lombard kings underwent their own transformation during the century and a half of their rule in Italy. The early Lombard period was marked by paganism and Arianism that put the Lombards at odds with the Roman population and the Roman Church. Over the course of the 7th century this changed. Lombard kings converted to Nicene Christianity, a shift whose political implications paralleled what Clovis's conversion had meant for the Franks. The conversion created a common religious framework within which negotiation between the kingdom and the papacy became possible in ways it had not been before. The legal tradition of the Lombard kingdom, compiled in the Edictum Rothari of 643 and expanded by subsequent kings, is one of the more interesting documents of the post-Roman period. It shows the influence of Roman legal thinking in its structure and in specific provisions, while maintaining distinctly Germanic principles in areas like family law and the system of monetary compensation for injuries and offences. For historians of the period, these codes are invaluable precisely because they were describing how Lombard society actually functioned rather than how it aspired to function. The end of the independent Lombard kingdom came in 774, when Charlemagne crossed the Alps in response to a papal request and his own political interests, besieged the Lombard capital at Pavia, and accepted its surrender. The last Lombard king, Desiderius, was sent to a Frankish monastery. Charlemagne took the Lombard crown and added it to his collection. But the Lombard presence in Italy did not end with the kingdom. The Lombard population that had settled in northern and central Italy over 2 centuries did not disappear. They remained, gradually integrating with the Roman population, their language contributing elements to the developing Italian dialects of the region, their customary practices blending with Roman traditions to produce the mixed legal and social culture of early medieval northern Italy. The name Lombardy survives today, attached to one of the most economically significant regions of modern Italy. The word Lombard passed into medieval European languages as a term for bankers and financiers, reflecting the prominent role that people from this region played in the financial networks of medieval Europe. Go back to the farmer in the Po Valley. His grandchildren grow up speaking a dialect that carries Lombard words alongside Latin ones. They are governed by laws that mix Lombard custom with Roman principle. They worship in churches that a Lombard king helped fund. They do not think of themselves as Romans or as Lombards. They think of themselves as people of this valley, this city, this particular piece of ground that multiple peoples have called home. That is what assimilation actually looks like from the inside. Not a victory, not a defeat, a life, built from whatever was available, in a valley that remembered everyone who had ever crossed it. Chapter 10. The Anglo-Saxons building Britain from the ashes. There is an island at the northwestern edge of the Roman world that Rome governed effectively in its lowland regions for nearly 4 centuries, while the highland north remained beyond reliable imperial control. A frontier zone that Hadrian's Wall, built beginning in 122, stretching from sea to sea across the width of the island, acknowledged as the practical boundary of what Roman administration could hold. South of that wall, Roman Britain had developed into a recognizable provincial civilization. Towns, roads, villas, bathhouses, Christian communities, and a literate administrative class that spoke Latin and participated in the broader culture of the empire. It was not Italy or Gaul in its sophistication, but it was unmistakably Roman in its basic organization. In 410, that organization ended. The Emperor Honorius, dealing with the crisis of Alaric's siege of Rome, sent a message to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defense. Whether this represents a formal imperial abandonment or a temporary measure during a crisis is debated by historians. But the practical effect was the same. The military infrastructure that had protected the province withdrew and did not return. The Romano-British communities left behind faced a challenge that their Roman formation had not prepared them for. Roman Britain had been governed through a system of administration, taxation, and military organization that depended entirely on the imperial infrastructure that maintained it. The towns, the roads, the monetary economy, the legal system, the ecclesiastical organization developing across the 4th century. All of these were integrated into a wider Roman system in ways that made them difficult to sustain independently when that system withdrew. The elite families, who had held administrative positions, found themselves facing a situation for which their Roman training had not prepared them. They knew how to participate in a Roman system. They were considerably less certain about how to replace one. What followed in the 5th century is one of the most difficult periods of British history to reconstruct, because the written sources are sparse and late. The archaeological evidence requires careful interpretation, and the gap between what actually happened and the legends that developed to explain it is very hard to measure with confidence. What the evidence suggests is something like this. In the decades after Roman withdrawal, British communities continued to function in reduced form, maintaining some physical infrastructure while the institutional framework supporting it gradually weakened. Local leaders of various kinds, some using Roman titles and traditions, others drawing on older British practices, attempted to maintain order in their regions. Christianity, which had established itself during the Roman period, continued as a thread of cultural continuity. Into this landscape came people from across the North Sea. The Angles, Saxon, and Jutes came from the coastal regions of what is now northwestern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Their arrival was not a single organized invasion. It was a process that unfolded over more than a century, through raiding, settlement, invitation, and gradual territorial expansion that interacted differently with different British communities in different regions. Some of the earliest Germanic arrivals came not as uninvited raiders, but in response to requests from British leaders who needed military assistance. A version of the foederati relationship that had operated throughout the late Roman West. Britain experienced its own variant of that pattern, with the difference that there was no longer an imperial government to set the terms or enforce them when they broke down. The breakdown, when it came, produced the violence that left deep marks on both the archaeological record and the legendary memory of the period. The figure of Arthur enters the story here. Or rather, the question of whether any historical figure underlies the legend enters the story here. Because the honest answer involves considerable uncertainty. The sources that mention a historical Arthur figure, primarily a text called the Historia Brittonum, compiled in the 9th century, and the later Annales Cambriae, are far removed in time from the events they describe and have been shaped by the literary and political purposes of their own periods. There may have been a military commander of Romano-British background who organized effective resistance against Anglo-Saxon expansion in the late 5th or early 6th century. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the Anglo-Saxon expansion was not swift, was not unopposed, and took most of the 5th and 6th centuries to produce the predominantly Germanic-speaking lowland England that emerges clearly in the historical record by the 7th century. British populations were not simply replaced. Some moved west into Wales and Cornwall, where British language and culture maintained themselves. Others crossed the sea to the region of northwestern France that still carries their name, Brittany. Others remained in territories that became Anglo-Saxon, gradually losing their language and their distinct cultural identity through the same process of assimilation that characterized so much of the migration period. The 7 kingdoms that emerged from this process. The arrangement historians call the heptarchy, while acknowledging that the reality was more fluid than a neat 7-kingdom map suggests. Each had distinct characters and dynastic traditions. Northumbria in the north, shaped by its position between the Anglo-Saxon south and the Gaelic and Pictish cultures beyond Hadrian's Wall. Mercia in the Midlands, which under King Offa in the 8th century built the great earthwork along the Welsh border that still bears his name and corresponded with Charlemagne as something approaching an equal. East Anglia, whose royal dynasty left the most spectacular archaeological evidence of early Anglo-Saxon culture in the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, where a king was interred with a treasure of extraordinary richness. His iron helmet's faceplate staring across 14 centuries at the people who excavated it in 1939, and Wessex in the south, whose royal line would eventually produce the king who came closest to unifying all of England. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England came from 2 directions simultaneously, and their meeting produced a cultural creativity of the first order. From the south came the mission sent by Pope Gregory I in 597, led by a monk named Augustine, landing in Kent and converting the Kentish king Ethelbert, establishing the See of Canterbury that remains the primary seat of the English Church today. From the north came the Celtic Christianity that had developed in Ireland during the centuries of post-Roman disruption, carried into northern Britain by missionaries, including Columba, who established the monastery of Iona off the western coast of Scotland in 563. Irish Christianity had its own distinctive practices, its own approach to monastic organization, and a remarkable tradition of scholarship and manuscript production that had preserved and transmitted classical learning through the most turbulent period of post-Roman disruption. The 2 traditions came into formal tension at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where the Northumbrian king Oswiu arbitrated between them on the question of calculating the date of Easter. a question that sounds technical, but represented a fundamental issue of authority and tradition within the Church. Oswiu decided in favour of the Roman position, aligning Anglo-Saxon England with the institutional Church centred on Rome and setting the trajectory for subsequent English Christianity. What emerged from the meeting of these two streams was extraordinary. Consider a monk at the monastery of Jarrow, born around 672, sitting at a desk by a window that looks out over the cold grey water of the River Tyne. He has been here since childhood. He has rarely travelled more than a few miles from this building, and yet he is engaged, through the books that the monastery has collected from across the world, in a conversation with the entire history of human learning. His name is Beda. History would call him the Venerable. He wrote works of history, biblical commentary, scientific observation, and chronological analysis that were among the finest intellectual productions of the early medieval period anywhere in Europe. His ecclesiastical history of the English people remains the primary written source for much of early Anglo-Saxon history, a work of careful source criticism and narrative intelligence that established a model of historical writing influencing scholars across the medieval period. Bede also made significant contributions to the standardization of the Anno Domini dating system, the counting of years from the birth of Christ that the modern world still uses. Across the water from Jarrow, on the island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, monks produced around 715 a manuscript that represents perhaps the finest surviving example of early medieval art. The Lindisfarne Gospels contains the 4 Gospels in Latin, decorated with illuminations of breathtaking complexity. Their interlaced patterns and intricate ornamental pages drawing simultaneously on Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean artistic traditions in a synthesis that could only have been produced at a cultural meeting point like Northumbria. It is a book that stops people in their tracks at the British Library today, 13 centuries after it was made. The people who made these things were the descendants, biologically and culturally, of the Germanic settlers who had crossed the North Sea in the 5th and 6th centuries. Within 3 generations of the completion of the Anglo-Saxon settlement, their descendants were producing some of the finest scholarship and art in the Western world. That is the same process that had happened with the Visigoths and the Franks and the Lombards, each in their own form, and it would happen again, in the next generation, with the people who came after them. The language those monks spoke, the language Bede used to write his history and the scribes of Lindisfarne used to annotate their Gospels in the margins, is the ancestor of the language being spoken right now. The most fundamental words in modern English, the words for basic human experiences and physical realities, preserve its structure and its sound. The words for eat and drink and sleep and dream. The words for mother and father and child and home. The words for earth and water and fire and sky. 14 centuries separate us from the man at the desk by the River Tyne. The language that connects us is still warm. Chapter 11. Charlemagne, the man who tried to restart Rome. It is Christmas Day in the year 800. The city of Rome, the great Basilica of St. Peter, built above the place where the apostle was held by tradition to have been buried. Its interior lit by hundreds of candles, whose light moves across mosaics and marble, and the faces of an assembled congregation of clergy and nobility. A man kneels in prayer at the tomb. He is in his late 50s, tall by the standards of his age, broad through the shoulders, with a thick neck and a manner that the people who knew him describe as commanding, even in moments of apparent stillness. He has been king of the Franks for more than 30 years. He has campaigned from the Spanish March to the Elbe River, from the coast of the English Channel to the borderlands of the Avar Steppe. In territorial terms, he has already assembled the largest single authority in the West since the fall of the Western Empire. And then Pope Leo III places a crown on his head, and the assembled congregation shouts, in Latin, "Long life and victory to Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans." What happens next is one of the more genuinely puzzling moments in a period full of puzzling moments. Charlemagne, according to his biographer Einhard, who knew him personally and wrote an account of his life in the years following his death, said afterward that he would not have entered the church that day if he had known what the Pope intended. He was displeased. Einhard records, by the manner of the coronation. Historians have interpreted this claim in many ways over the centuries, and the honest answer is that we cannot be certain what Charlemagne actually felt. The most persuasive reading is that the coronation, by making him emperor in a ceremony initiated and conducted by the Pope, established a precedent he may not have wanted. An emperor who received his crown from a pope was, at least implicitly, in a position of dependency on papal authority that a king who held his position by inheritance and military success was not. For a ruler of Charlemagne's power and political intelligence, that implication had consequences. He could see clearly, even in the moment of triumph. Whether or not he was genuinely surprised by what Leo did that Christmas morning, the coronation took place, and its implications were real, regardless of anyone's intentions. After more than 3 centuries, the title of Emperor of the Romans had returned to the West. Constantinople was not pleased. Constantinople was also, in 800, in no position to do very much about it. To understand how Charlemagne arrived at that moment in St. Peter's, you need to begin with the man himself. Before the crown and the legend, he was born around 742, the son of Pippin III, who had taken the Frankish throne from the last Merovingian king in 751 with formal papal blessing. Charlemagne and his brother Carloman inherited the kingdom jointly when Pippin died in 768. Carloman died in 771 before the usual fratricidal conflict had time to develop, and Charlemagne became sole ruler. What followed was more than 4 decades of almost continuous military activity, combined with a program of administrative and cultural reform that together represent one of the most ambitious governance projects of the early medieval period. The military campaigns were extensive and sometimes brutal in ways that the sources record without flinching. The conquest of the Saxons, a Germanic people occupying the territory of what is now northwestern Germany, who had resisted both Frankish expansion and Christian conversion for generations, lasted more than 30 years. From 772 to 804, it was a cycle of conquest, revolt, reconquest, and renewed resistance that consumed enormous resources and produced violence on both sides across 3 decades. The event that generated the most serious controversy, both among contemporaries and among historians since, occurred in 782 at a place called Verdun on the Aller River. Charlemagne ordered the execution of a large number of Saxon captives who had been involved in a revolt. The Frankish royal annals record the event, and it drew concern from contemporaries, including the scholar Alcuin of York, who was among the most trusted members of Charlemagne's court, and who wrote to him arguing that genuine Christian faith could not be produced by compulsion, and that the approach risked creating Christians in name only. The exact numbers given in the sources for those executed are large, and historians treat the specific figures with caution. While not disputing that the event occurred and that it represented violence on a significant scale, used deliberately to break resistance, Charlemagne engaged with Alcuin's arguments seriously enough to moderate some of the harsher provisions of his Saxon policies in later years. though he did not abandon the underlying approach. Whether this represented genuine persuasion or practical acknowledgement that compelled conversion was producing the unstable results Alcuin had predicted. The sources do not clearly answer. The Italian campaign was more straightforward. The Lombard king Desiderius had been threatening papal territories in ways that made him an obstacle to both Charlemagne's ambitions and to the security of the papacy. Charlemagne invaded in 773, besieged Pavia, accepted its surrender in 774, and had Desiderius sent to a Frankish monastery. He took the Lombard crown and added it to the Frankish one. The campaign against the Avars in the 790s produced one of the largest single transfers of wealth in the history of the early medieval period. The Avar Ring Fortress, the centre of accumulated tribute gathered over generations of steppe raiding, was taken and its contents distributed among Charlemagne's followers and the church in quantities that contemporary sources describe with the specific wonder of people who had never seen so much precious metal concentrated in one place. Against the background of all this military activity, something else was happening at Charlemagne's court that deserves equal attention. He assembled at his palace at Aachen the finest scholars available in the post-Roman world. Alcuin of York came from England, bringing the tradition of Northumbrian learning that Bede had represented at its finest. Paul the Deacon, a Lombard scholar who wrote a history of the Lombard people that remains a primary source for the period, spent years at the Frankish court. Theodoric, a Visigoth from Spain, became one of Charlemagne's most trusted advisors and a significant theological voice. Einhard, who would become Charlemagne's biographer, was educated at court and remained close to him for the rest of his life. What this gathering produced was not a renaissance in the modern sense of a recovery of classical antiquity for its own sake. Though classical texts were certainly studied and copied, it was something more practical and more immediately consequential. A systematic effort to raise the quality of literacy and administration throughout the Frankish kingdom, driven by the recognition that governing an empire required more literate administrators than the Frankish world currently possessed. Charlemagne issued capitularies requiring monasteries and cathedral churches to establish schools capable of teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and Latin, a new handwriting script, the Caroline minuscule, developed with Alcuin's involvement, made manuscripts faster to produce and easier to read, contributing to the efficiency of written communication across the kingdom. The copying of manuscripts in the scriptorium at Aachen and in the monasteries under Frankish influence preserved texts that might otherwise have been lost during the continued disruptions of the period. Now, to the man himself, behind the campaigns and the capitularies. Einhard's biography, written in the years after Charlemagne's death in 814, is our most detailed source for his personal characteristics, and it should be read with the understanding that Einhard admired his subject deeply and consciously modelled his account on the Roman biographical tradition of Suetonius. The portrait is favourable in ways that cannot always be independently verified. What Einhard describes is a man of considerable physical presence and remarkable sustained energy, who maintained his health through regular exercise throughout his life, who ate and drank with relative moderation by the standards of his court, and who was genuinely, and not merely performatively, interested in learning. The detail about his efforts to master writing, which Einhard says he practiced late in life by keeping tablets under his pillow so he could work on the letters in the night hours, is one of the more humanizing passages in the biography. A man of enormous worldly power, who had commanded armies across a continent, genuinely frustrated by a skill that came less easily to him than conquest. He was married multiple times and had numerous children by his wives and by concubines, a pattern entirely normal by Frankish aristocratic standards and entirely inconsistent with the Christian sexual ethics he publicly championed. His court was, in this respect, a place where the ideals proclaimed and the lives lived coexisted in tensions that contemporaries noted without apparently finding disqualifying. The administration of the empire he had assembled faced a fundamental challenge that no amount of personal energy could fully solve. How do you govern a vast and culturally diverse territory with the communication technology of the 9th century? When a message from Aachen to the Spanish March took weeks, and when the men appointed to govern distant territories will inevitably develop interests that do not always align with the center. The system of counts and royal envoys was more sophisticated than anything the Merovingian period had produced, but it remained dependent on the personal authority of the emperor himself, on his ability to travel, to inspect, to reward and punish, to project enough personal presence across enough of the territory that his representatives knew they were being watched. When Charlemagne was that emperor, it worked. Imperfectly, but well enough. Whether it could survive him was always the question. He died on the 28th of January, 814, at Aachen, after a reign of more than 40 years. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited an empire that was already showing the stresses of its size and its internal diversity. Within a generation of Charlemagne's death, the empire was divided. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, agreed among his 3 grandsons after years of civil war following Louis's death, divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. The western portion went to Charles the Bald and became the foundation of what developed into France. The eastern portion went to Louis the German and became the foundation of what developed into Germany. A middle portion, including Italy, went to Lothair, who held the imperial title, and this middle kingdom fragmented further over the following generations. The political map that emerged from Verdun should not be read too directly onto modern national boundaries, because the processes that produced modern France and Germany were long and complex and involved centuries of development after Verdun. But there is a genuine observation to be made. The division established a lasting fault line between a Western Frankish world more oriented toward Romance language and tradition, and an Eastern Frankish world retaining a stronger Germanic character. A distinction that left traces in European political culture for far longer than the political entities that produced it. The Carolingian Empire did not survive as a political entity, but the idea it represented, that the Christian kingdoms of the West formed a common civilization under shared spiritual authority, that there was such a thing as Christendom whose political arrangements should reflect its religious unity, that a ruler of sufficient legitimacy and power could aspire to govern not just a territory but a world. That idea survived the empire that had given it its clearest expression. It would generate 1,000 years of argument about who was entitled to embody it. Charlemagne had not answered that question. He had made it impossible to stop asking. Chapter 12. Women, Saint, and the Power Behind the Thrones. There is a room in the monastery of Whitby, on the cliff edge above the North Sea, sometime in the year 663. Outside the window, the sea is the colour of iron. Below, the waves move against the rock with the specific patience of something that has been doing this for longer than anyone can remember. Inside the room, a woman is reading. She is not young. She came to this life late, after years in the secular world, after marriage and the kind of accumulated experience that either hardens a person or makes them wise. She is wise by the evidence of everything that happened around her. Her name is Hilda, and she is the abbess of this place, responsible for the monks and the nuns and the students and the workers and the visitors, responsible for the lands that support them and the books that educate them, and the hospitality that sustains the relationship between this monastery and the world beyond its walls. Tomorrow the bishops will arrive. They will gather in the hall she has prepared for them and debate a question about the calculation of Easter that sounds, to anyone outside the church, impossibly technical and impossibly consequential simultaneously. The outcome of their debate will determine whether the Anglo-Saxon church aligns with Rome or with Ireland, which means it will shape the trajectory of English Christianity for centuries. The debate will happen at her monastery because she is the kind of person in whose presence important things happen, because her judgment is trusted across the boundaries of faction and tradition in ways that few people of any gender achieve. She does not hold a title that appears in any formal chronicle of kings and battles. She holds something harder to define and considerably harder to take away. Now step back from Whitby and see the larger picture that Hilda is part of. There is a way of telling the story of the post-Roman kingdoms that makes it sound almost entirely like a story about men, kings and generals and bishops. The names that appear in the chapter headings of this story are almost without exception the names of men who held formal power, who commanded armies, who sat on thrones and issued laws in their own names. This version of the story is not false. Those men were real, and their decisions shaped the centuries we have been following. But it is radically incomplete, and the incompleteness reflects the nature of the sources themselves. Written almost entirely by men, organized around the formal institutions that men dominated, filtered through assumptions about which kinds of activity were significant enough to record. When you look past those filters, paying attention to what the sources reveal despite themselves, a different dimension of this story becomes visible. Begin with the woman who may have changed the religious trajectory of Western Europe from a room she did not officially govern. Clotilde was a Burgundian princess, a Nicene Christian, who married the Frankish king Clovis I around 493. The sources about her come primarily from Gregory of Tours, writing decades after her death, and they need to be read with awareness that Gregory was constructing a providential narrative in which Clotilde's role served specific theological purposes. With that caveat in place, what Gregory describes is a woman who worked persistently and over years to bring her husband toward Christian baptism, who had their children baptized over his initial resistance, who argued with him about faith in terms specific enough to suggest real conversations rather than invented theology. Whether Clotilde was as central to Clovis's conversion as Gregory presents her is a question the evidence cannot definitively resolve. What is clear is that Gregory, writing when the consequences of that conversion were already reshaping everything about the Frankish world, found it necessary to make a woman the primary human agent of the most consequential religious decision in Frankish history. Even a tradition that systematically undervalued women's agency acknowledged, in this case, that a woman had done something that mattered enormously. Now come to the conflict that brought the darker dimensions of female political power into the sharpest possible focus. Brunhilde and Fredegund. Brunhilde came from the Visigothic royal family of Spain. Educated in a court culture more sophisticated than the Frankish one, she entered when she married King Sigibert I of Austrasia in the 560s. She built and maintained roads in the territories under her control, a practical act of governance that preserved Roman infrastructure in ways that mattered enormously for the communities living along those roads. She corresponded with Pope Gregory I on matters of church organization, conducting herself in those letters as an equal participant in the governance of the Western Church. She governed as regent for her son after Sigibert's assassination, and then for her grandsons after her son's death, maintaining the cohesion of the Austrasian kingdom through transitions that might otherwise have fragmented it. Her husband was murdered in 575, killed by agents acting at the direction of his sister-in-law Fredegund. Fredegund came from a background the sources describe as common rather than noble, a liability she overcame through intelligence. absolute ruthlessness, and the complete confidence of King Chilperic, whose favour she had obtained and retained with an effectiveness that speaks to real personal capability. Whatever one thinks of the methods attributed to her, the sources, which are mostly hostile to her, attribute to her a series of political murders spanning decades. Whether all of these attributions are accurate, or whether some represent hostile projection onto a woman who was simply more formidable than her enemies found comfortable, is a question the sources do not resolve cleanly. What is not seriously disputed is that she was a genuine and significant political operator whose influence on Frankish affairs extended well beyond what her formal position should have allowed. The conflict between them was conducted through husbands, son, allies, and assassins across 4 decades. It was fought over the structure of Frankish royal authority, over which branch of the Merovingian dynasty would control the resources and alliances that determined who governed effectively. It was personal and political simultaneously, in the way that conflicts between people with real stakes in real outcomes always are. It ended in 613 when Fredegund's son Hlothar II captured Brunhilde after a military victory and executed her. She was approximately 70 years old. She had governed portions of the Frankish world, by most reasonable assessments, for nearly 40 years. What she received in return was the most humiliating death the victorious side could devise. A public degradation intended to make clear what happened to women who wielded power on the scale she had wielded it. Stay with that for a moment. A woman of 70, who had maintained a kingdom across the reigns of 3 generations of kings, who had built roads and written to popes, and kept the eastern Frankish territories functioning through decades of internal warfare, was executed in a manner designed primarily to humiliate the political threat she represented, even in defeat. He was apparently large enough to require not just removal but a statement. History rarely pauses long enough on moments like this to let their full weight land. Now come back to the room in Whitby, to Hilda, reading by the window above the iron-coloured sea. The monastery she leads is a different kind of power than the kind Brunhilde exercised. It is less visible, less dramatic, less vulnerable to the specific violence that ended Brunhilde's life. But it is not less real. The practical importance of the monasteries for the survival of learning through the post-Roman centuries cannot be overstated. In a world where the secular institutions that had supported literacy in the Roman period had been disrupted or destroyed, the monasteries became the primary places where books were copied and where people were trained to read and write with sufficient skill to produce new books. The scriptorium was a place of active intellectual work, where the accumulated learning of the ancient world was engaged with, transmitted, and built upon generation by generation. Women participated in this monastic world in ways that gave them access to forms of authority unavailable in the secular realm. The abbess of a large and wealthy monastery controlled significant economic resources. She managed a community that provided services no secular institution could reliably supply. She corresponded with bishops and rulers and popes in ways that gave her a voice in the public affairs of her region. Hilda trained men who became bishops. The Venerable Bede, writing a generation after her death, described her as someone whose wisdom was recognized by everyone from the highest nobility to the most ordinary members of her community. 5 men she trained became bishops of the English Church. The Synod of Whitby, which shaped English Christianity for centuries, happened at her monastery because she was the kind of person in whose presence important things happened. Consider also Hadegund of Thuringia. She had been captured in war by the Frankish king Clothar I, who made her one of his wives, a situation she endured rather than accepted. She eventually obtained permission to leave the Frankish court and enter religious life, founding a convent at Poitiers in Western Gaul that became one of the most significant cultural centres of 6th century Frankish life. Imagine her there, in the courtyard at Poitiers, on an evening in the 560s. The garden she tends is fragrant with herbs she grows for the sick who come to her. Around her are women of various backgrounds, some noble, some common, all of them living within the rules of her community, all of them learning to read. The library she has built contains manuscripts gathered from across the former Roman world. A poet named Venantius Fortunatus arrives that evening with new verses he has written for her, continuing a correspondence that is one of the most remarkable friendships documented in 6th century literature. She reads what he has written. She responds with her own thoughts. And the exchange that results is preserved across 15 centuries in ways that the formal records of kings and battles are not. She obtained a fragment of the true cross through diplomatic negotiation with the Eastern Emperor Justin II, a piece of relic diplomacy conducted at the highest level of international politics by a woman who had no formal political title and no army. The fragment gave her community a prestige that drew scholars, pilgrims, and patrons from across the Frankish world. A woman who had been treated as a spoil of war, built, from the resources of her religious vocation and her personal reputation, one of the most intellectually alive communities in post-Roman Gaul. The record of her life is not a footnote. It is evidence of a kind of power that the chronicles consistently fail to recognize as power because it did not look like armies. The pattern these women represent is consistent across the post-Roman centuries. Formal secular power was largely closed to women, with the significant but always contested exception of regency, religious authority, in the specific forms available through monasticism and through the influence that came with genuine spiritual reputation, provided spaces where women could exercise genuine influence over the world around them. And then there are the saints, whose importance for the organization of post-Roman communities is easy to underestimate from a modern distance. The tomb of a recognized saint was a place of power in the early medieval world. It was a place where the accumulated spiritual credit of a holy life could be accessed by those who came in need, where miracles were expected and sometimes reported, where the boundary between the living and the dead was understood as permeable in ways that gave communities a form of continuity across the disruptions of political change. The bishop who managed an important shrine controlled a resource that was simultaneously spiritual, economic, and political, and the combination gave ecclesiastical authority a practical dimension that purely secular analysis of the period consistently undervalues. What this entire dimension adds to the story of the post-Roman kingdoms is not a corrective that replaces the conventional narrative, but a supplement that completes it. The kingdoms built by the Visigoths and the Franks and the Lombards and the Anglo-Saxons functioned through the daily work of thousands of people whose names were mostly not recorded, including the women who governed monasteries, influenced conversions, and maintained institutions through centuries of political disruption, including the monks and nuns who copied manuscripts in the night hours and trained the next generation of literate administrators, including the saints, real and legendary, whose tombs organized the spiritual geography of communities across the post-Roman West. Hilda, setting down her book as the evening light fades above the North Sea, preparing for tomorrow when the bishops come. She does not know she is part of a pattern that runs through all of this. She knows only that the work is there, and that it is hers to do. Chapter 13. What the Barbarians actually built. In the late spring of the year 500, a merchant is making his way from the port city of Marseille northward through the Rhône Valley toward the Frankish kingdom. He carries spices from the eastern Mediterranean, papyrus from Egypt, silk from farther east than most people in Gaul can easily imagine. He travels on a road that Roman engineers built 2 centuries before he was born, and that local administrators have maintained well enough that his cart does not lose a wheel before Lyon. He stops at a church in Arles, whose bishop speaks to him in Latin, the same Latin he uses in Marseille, the same Latin he will use in the Frankish court when he arrives. He pays taxes at a toll point administered by clerks using Roman accounting methods. He is traveling through a world that is not Rome, but it is a world that Rome made possible, and that the post-Roman kingdoms are, each in their own imperfect way, trying to keep working. What did those kingdoms actually build, preserve, and lose? Begin with the losses, because they were real and substantial, and the honest accounting of this period requires looking at them directly. The population of the western former Roman territories declined during the 5th and 6th centuries. The evidence comes from multiple sources: archaeological surveys of settlement patterns, analysis of agricultural production indicators, pollen records showing the extent of land abandonment, and the testimony of contemporary writers describing depopulated regions that had been densely settled a century before. The scale of the decline and its precise timing vary by region and remain subjects of scholarly discussion, but the broad direction is not seriously disputed. There were fewer people in most of the former Western Empire in 600 than there had been in 300, and the conditions of life for the people who remained were, by most measurable indicators, harder. The aqueducts that had supplied clean water to Roman cities fell into disrepair at different rates in different places. But the overall trend was decline and eventual failure. The drainage systems of low-lying agricultural areas required continuous organized maintenance that the post-Roman states were often unable to provide consistently, with consequences for both agricultural productivity and public health that are reflected in the skeletal evidence from burial sites of the period. People in post-Roman Europe were, on average, shorter, died younger, and showed more signs of nutritional stress than their counterparts in the high imperial period. These are not abstractions. They are the traces of harder lives, recorded in the bones of people who had no idea they were living in a dark age and who were simply trying to manage the circumstances they found themselves in. The cities contracted in ways that represented genuine losses of human capability and human connection. Rome in 600 had a population that estimates suggest was a fraction of its peak imperial size. The forums and bath complexes and market halls that had organized urban life across the West fell into disuse, were quarried for building materials, were converted to other purposes, or simply collapsed over generations without the institutional capacity to maintain them. A person walking through most former Roman cities in 600 would have seen a landscape of monuments from a world that had passed, with small communities living in and around the ruins rather than filling the urban spaces those ruins had once defined. The contraction of literacy was another real loss whose consequences extended across centuries. In the imperial period, functional literacy in Latin had been widespread enough among the urban population and the administrative class to sustain a varied and substantial literary culture. The post-Roman centuries saw this base contract significantly, with practical literacy increasingly concentrated in the monasteries and the higher levels of the church. Outside those institutions, across large areas of the former Western Empire, the ability to read and write became increasingly rare, which meant that the accumulated knowledge encoded in written texts became inaccessible to most people most of the time. There are regions where the transmission of learning was fragile enough that specific technical knowledge, agricultural practices, medical knowledge, engineering techniques, was simply lost for generations, not destroyed dramatically, but forgotten quietly, in the way that knowledge forgets itself when the institutions that maintained it are disrupted and the people who held it die without successors, who know what they knew. These losses matter. They should not be minimized or explained away in the rush to find the silver linings of the period. And yet, now, to what was preserved. Because what survived was substantial, and its survival was not accidental. The transmission of Roman law is the most consequential example. The Visigothic law codes, the Burgundian law codes, the Lombard codes, the Carolingian capitularies, all drew on Roman legal thinking to significant degrees and transmitted elements of the Roman legal tradition into the medieval and eventually the modern world. When the law schools of Bologna and other medieval universities began the systematic study of Roman law in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were working with a tradition that had survived, in transformed and partial form, through the institutional memory of the Church and the post-Roman law codes. The idea that governance should rest on known and consistent rules, that there should be a meaningful distinction between arbitrary power and law, did not originate with Rome, but Rome gave it its most systematic and durable pre-modern expression, and the post-Roman kingdoms transmitted that expression forward in forms the future could build upon. The church organization preserved more of Roman administrative culture than any secular institution. The diocese, the basic unit of church organization, was built on the Roman administrative district. When secular administrative structures contracted, the episcopal network provided a surviving organizational framework that communities depended on for an enormous range of functions beyond the strictly religious. The Latin language survived the Western Empire by more than 1,000 years as the language of the Church, of scholarship, and of law. The spoken Latin of the Roman period developed, in the former Western provinces, into the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and others, carrying the Roman linguistic legacy into the vernacular traditions of communities that eventually stopped using classical Latin for everyday speech. Now to what was created that had not existed before. The post-Roman kingdoms developed forms of politically organized community that differed in important ways from the Roman model. The Roman Empire had governed diverse peoples under a single administrative structure, organized primarily by territory and legal citizenship. The Germanic kingdoms organized political community partly around shared cultural and ethnic identity, developing early forms of people-based kingship, in which the king ruled not just a territory, but a people defined by shared tradition and descent. Historians are careful about drawing too direct a line between these arrangements and later ideas of national identity, because the connections involve centuries of further development. But the shift from a territorial empire organized by citizenship to kingdoms organized partly by people identity was a real development of the post-Roman period with long-term consequences. The legal traditions that developed in the post-Roman West combined Roman and Germanic elements in ways that produced something neither tradition could have generated alone. The Roman tradition was strong on property, contract, and the organization of commercial society. The Germanic traditions contributed a strong emphasis on personal relationships, on the obligations flowing from loyalty and dependence, and on the concept that law was fundamentally about relations between persons. The medieval legal synthesis that emerged from this encounter was more complex and in some ways more adaptable than either tradition independently. The feudal organization of society that developed in the post-Roman and early medieval West was not a deliberate replacement for Roman provincial administration. It was an improvised response to the practical problem of governing large territories without the monetary economy, the professional administrative class, and the communication infrastructure that Roman governance had depended upon. A system that provided the basic framework for organizing large parts of European society for 5 centuries was not a failed system by any reasonable standard. It was a system that solved the problems it was built to solve, even while generating new problems that subsequent centuries would need to address. Now step back from the inventory and consider the larger question honestly. Did the post-Roman kingdoms succeed or fail at what they attempted? The question is not quite right. The post-Roman kingdoms were not trying to replace Rome in any simple or conscious sense. They were trying to govern territories and populations in specific circumstances with the tools and traditions available to them. Some of what Rome had built was preserved because it served the needs of the new arrangements. Some was lost because maintaining it exceeded the available organizational capacity. Some new things were built because the new circumstances required new solutions. What emerged from the centuries of disruption, experimentation, and gradual stabilization was not Rome. But it was not nothing. It was a civilization in formation, working out the organizational principles that would eventually support the universities of the 12th century, the legal revolutions of the 13th, the intellectual and artistic achievements that followed. None of those later developments were inevitable consequences of what the post-Roman kingdoms built, but all of them grew in ground that the post-Roman period had prepared. Go back to the merchant on the road from Marseille. He arrives at the Frankish court. He sells his spices. He sleeps in a hall that would have been recognizable in its basic function, if not its elegance, to any Roman trader from 2 centuries before. He will make this journey again next year, and the year after that, and the road will still be there, and the bishop in Arles will still speak Latin, and the accounting clerks will still use Roman numbers. He does not know he is living through a dark age. He knows he is living through a Tuesday. The men and women who built the post-Roman kingdoms were working without a plan, improvising in real time, managing immediate demands with whatever resources they could assemble, drawing on traditions they had partially absorbed and partially misunderstood, building institutions that solved some problems while creating others. That is what every civilization in every period has done. Some of what they built lasted. Some of it is still here. Come back to the beginning. It is a late summer evening in Ravenna in the year 476. The torchlight is steady. A teenage boy is walking away from a crown he never wanted, toward a long and quiet life by the sea that no one, least of all him, anticipated. He lived, the sources suggest, well into the early 6th century. He outlasted Odoacer, who was killed in 493. He may have outlasted Theodoric himself, who died in 526. The boy who handed over the symbols of 1,000 years of Roman power on a Tuesday evening in a minor palace in a canal city grew old on the Campanian coast, while the world that Crown had nominally represented was being remade around him. What was remade was not Rome, but it carried Rome forward in forms Rome itself would not have recognized and could not have anticipated. Theodoric, standing in his palace at Ravenna, governing his mixed kingdom with a sophistication that would have impressed any Roman administrator, until the fear that he was never truly accepted took over and destroyed what he had built, was both the Gothic king his birth had made him and the Roman administrator his education had shaped. He was not one or the other. He was both simultaneously, in the way that people who live between worlds always are. Boethius in his cell, writing about the consolations available to a man that fortune had abandoned, was composing in Latin about Greek philosophy in a prison ordered by a Gothic king, in a world that was neither Roman nor Germanic, but something in between that had not yet fully found its name. He did not know that 1,000 years of readers would find in his book exactly what he had found in writing it. A way of thinking clearly about loss without being destroyed by it. Hilda in her room, above the iron-coloured sea, preparing for the bishops who would arrive tomorrow to debate a question that would shape English Christianity for centuries, was doing what the best people in every age do. She was using the authority she had built, carefully and over decades, in service of something larger than herself. They were all building civilization the way civilization has always been built. Not by visionaries who could see the completed structure, by ordinary people doing the next necessary thing. The ruins of Rome were never simply ruins. They were always also the foundation of what came after. The men and women who stepped into those ruins did not destroy civilization, they became it. Sleep well,